She was promised to a dangerous man disguised as a gentleman. He was a French count who had forgotten how to smile after the war. When their eyes met for the first time, something awakened in both of them. Dangerous, forbidden, impossible to ignore. A single glance changed everything. A stolen touch sealed their destinies. But can love win when time is running out? Subscribe now, leave your like, and hit the bell icon. You do not want to miss a second of this story. Lady Agnès. Harbury's estate rose over the Kent hills like a deliberate dream, all limestone bathed in the golden light of May. The gardens stretched in careful terraces as far as the eye could see, and the climbing roses ascended the south walls with the patience of one who knows their place in the world. It was the kind of beauty that made no apologies for existing, the kind that caused guests to slow their pace upon arrival, as if the mere act of crossing the gates required reverence. Lady Clarisse Pemberton observed it all from her bedroom window, her fingers intertwined over the marble sill. The cool morning light caressed her pale skin, highlighting the slight dusting of freckles scattered across her cheekbones, as if someone had painted them with care. Her eyes, wide, clear, and a gentle blue, surveyed the gardens with a quiet curiosity, while a rebellious lock of her red hair, gleaming like copper warmed by the sun, escaped her updo and brushed her neck. She had been there for 3 days, enough time to memorize every curve of those gravel paths, every shadow cast by the ancient lime trees. Enough time also to understand that the Countess's kindness was not accidental. Lady Harbury had gathered under her roof a select group of eligible young ladies and gentlemen, all circling each other like planets in calculated orbits, and Clarisse knew exactly what role belonged to her in that social constellation. She was the bride, the promised one, the young woman who would soon wear white and walk to the altar to meet Lord Adrian Hawthorne, a man of considerable fortune and impeccable reputation. Her father had repeated these two qualities so many times in recent months that they had lost any resemblance to virtues and had begun to sound like numbers in a ledger. Considerable fortune, impeccable reputation, as if a marriage could be summarized by a well-organized inventory. The door opened without warning, and Clarisse turned, already knowing who she would find. Lord Hawthorne entered with that posture he cultivated so carefully, his shoulders always aligned, his chin always at the precise angle between authority and courtesy. He was handsome, she could not deny. Dark hair slicked back, symmetrical features that seemed sculpted to make a good impression in crowded drawing rooms. But there was something about the way he looked at her that made her wish to be anywhere else. Clarisse. He pronounced her name, like someone signing a document. I came to escort you for tea. Lady Harbury awaits us in the drawing room. She nodded, allowing him to take her arm with that touch that was always a little too firm, his hand resting on her arm with calculated firmness, as if making sure to remind her of his presence. They descended the grand staircase together, and any distracted observer would say they made a charming pair. But Clarisse felt the weight of those fingers like chains, and when he leaned in to whisper something in her ear, she had to restrain the impulse to recoil. You behaved very well last night, he murmured, and there was something in the compliment that sounded more like a warning than praise. Continue as such. Discretion is a virtue I greatly value in my future wife. She did not reply. She had learned that silence was the safest answer. The drawing room was filled with the soft afternoon light, filtered through silk curtains that transformed everything into a warm amber hue. Lady Harbury presided over the scene from her favorite armchair, a magnificent creature of 58 who wore her widowhood like a crown. Her grey eyes sparkled with sharp intelligence, and when she smiled, which she did frequently, there was always a second layer of meaning that only the most attentive could decipher. "Ah, the lovebirds," she exclaimed upon seeing them enter, but the look she cast Clarisse carried a question the young woman could not interpret. "Come, come, we have news this afternoon." Clarisse settled where Hawthorne led her, her hands resting in her lap with the composure she had been taught since childhood. Around them, other young ladies conversed in melodious tones, and the gentlemen present distributed measured smiles while balancing porcelain cups, as if this were the height of human adventure. It was all very civilized, all very correct, all very suffocating. "We shall receive an additional guest tonight," Lady Harbury announced, and there was something in her voice that made everyone turn to her. An old family friend, newly arrived from Paris. The Comte Étienne de Valois. The name hung in the air like incense smoke. French. The war had ended only months ago, and the wounds were still too fresh for the mention of France not to provoke an uncomfortable silence. Clarisse saw Hawthorne stiffen beside her, his fingers gripping the cup handle with unnecessary force. "A Frenchman," he repeated, and it was not a question. "Interesting choice of company, Lady Harbury." The Countess smiled, and there was steel in that curve of her lips. "Interesting, yes. The Comte served at Waterloo, on the side we know all too well. But the war is over, Lord Hawthorne, and sensible men know when it is time to build bridges instead of walls." She did not wait for a reply, already turning to explain to the others that the Comte was in England to deal with matters related to properties. Divided between the two nations after the Congress of Vienna, legal issues, inheritances complicated by the war, nothing that should disturb the peace of a well-orchestrated social season. But Clarisse noticed how Lady Harbury avoided looking directly at Hawthorne as she spoke, as if she knew he would not be pleased and chose simply not to care. Dinner that evening was announced with the gentle chime of a gong, and everyone moved toward the dining hall with the rehearsed slowness of one who knows every movement is being observed. Clarisse allowed Hawthorne to lead her, but her attention repeatedly drifted to the main door, where a footman waited motionless. There was something in the air, an expectation she could not name. Then he arrived. The Comte Étienne de Valois entered like one crossing a battlefield, every step measured, every gesture contained in an economy of movement that spoke of years of command. He was not the tallest among the English gentlemen surrounding him, but there was a presence about him that made the space around him feel tighter, as if the room breathed deeper when he passed. He wore an impeccable suit, a perfectly cut black coat contrasting with the ivory white of his cravat, fabric that seemed to retain the candlelight. It was an elegance without ornamentation, naturally refined. His hair, brown like polished wood and slightly wavy, fell with calculated negligence, as if no hand dared try to fully discipline it. And his face, a study of striking lines, a firm chin, cheekbones carved with severity, and lips that seemed to have forgotten the art of smiling. But it was his eyes that captivated the room. Perfect amber green, like leaves on the verge of losing their color in autumn, deep and attentive. They scanned the environment with the lucidity of one who has assessed armies and judged intentions before they were enunciated. They were not exactly cold. There was a contained calm there, like an ember hidden beneath the surface. To look into them was like staring at the promise of warmth in a cold room, knowing that a single breath would be enough to awaken flames. Lady Harbury moved to greet him with a familiarity that surprised everyone, extending both hands as if he were a long-absent son. He inclined over them with a gentleness that contrasted strangely with all that rigidity, and when he spoke, his voice carried an accent that transformed every English word into something slightly exotic. "Lady Harbury, you are generous to receive me." "Nonsense," she replied, and there was genuine affection there. "You know this house has always been yours when you needed it. Come, let me introduce you." She led him through the room, and Clarisse observed how each person reacted slightly differently. The young ladies were curious, the gentlemen cautious. Hawthorne beside her had become a marble statue, his jaw so tight she could see the muscle pulsating beneath the skin. When Lady Harbury finally reached them, Clarisse felt something strange happen. The air seemed to change, becoming denser. She raised her eyes. She had to raise them. He was taller than he had seemed from a distance, and met that green gaze upon her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe for an instant. "Lady Clarisse Pemberton," Lady Harbury said, and there was a note of satisfaction in her voice that Clarisse did not understand. "Allow me to introduce Lord Étienne de Valois, the Comte Montclair." Clarisse made a perfect curtsy, exactly as she had been taught, and when she straightened, she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "My lord, it is an honor to receive you." He was silent for a moment that stretched beyond comfortable. He did not study her with the poorly disguised eagerness she was accustomed to receiving from gentlemen, nor with the polite indifference that would be appropriate. It was something else. It was as if he were seeing something no one else saw, as if he were looking through her to find something he had been searching for a long time. Étienne, though remaining still, felt a tremor that made him hold his breath. The color, that was it. That young woman radiated color. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than Clarisse expected, husky in a way that made the words sound confessional, even when they were not. I have long ceased to believe in honors, mademoiselle, but I believe in what I see." The silence that followed was broken only when Lord Hawthorne cleared his throat too loudly, a deliberately rude sound that made Lady Harbury narrow her eyes. She introduced the fiancé with a glacial formality, and the two men measured each other with the kind of appraisal that happens without words. "Lord Hawthorne," Étienne said, inclining his head the minimum required to be polite. "Comte." Hawthorne's reply was equally economical. Clarisse felt her fiancé's hand rest on her arm with a firmness that exceeded what was expected for a courteous gesture, subtly pulling her close to him like someone claiming property. She saw something flash in Étienne's eyes, a brief glimpse of something that could have been disapproval or recognition, before he diverted his gaze and allowed Lady Harbury to lead him to meet the other guests. Throughout dinner, Clarisse felt divided between two magnetic poles. On one side, Hawthorne at her right, dominating the conversation with stories calculated to impress, his hand occasionally resting on hers in a way that seemed affectionate, but which she knew to be possessive. On the other, across the table and 3 seats to the left, Étienne de Valois sat in near-complete silence, answering only when directly questioned, his replies too short to be rude but long enough to be polite. But it was at her he looked. Not constantly, not obviously, but Clarisse felt every time those penetrating eyes slid in. Her direction felt as if something within her recognized that attention and responded to it in ways she could not name. When dinner finally ended and the gentlemen separated from the ladies for brandy and cigars, Clarisse felt strangely relieved and strangely disappointed at the same time. Lady Harbury lightly touched her shoulder as they passed into the music room. "An interesting man, don't you think?" the Countess murmured, and there was something in her tone that made Clarisse blush without knowing exactly why. "He seems reserved," Clarisse replied, choosing her words carefully. "Reserved?" Lady Harbury repeated the word as if testing its weight. "Yes, war takes a great deal from a man. Sometimes it takes even his ability to smile." Clarisse looked at her in surprise, but the Countess was already moving away, leaving those words hanging in the air like seeds scattered to the wind, waiting to see where they would fall. Later, when Clarisse finally managed to retreat to her room, she stood again by the window looking out at the moonlit gardens. Down below, a solitary figure walked among the rose bushes, his hands clasped behind his back, his head slightly bowed like one carrying a weight no one else can see. She did not need to see his face to know who it was. She would recognize that posture anywhere now, that way of moving as if every step required a conscious effort of will. And as she watched, Clarisse realized something. That frightened her. For the first time in months since her father had announced the engagement to Hawthorne, she felt something beyond resignation. It was just a spark, too small to be named, but it was there, a possibility, a color returning to a world that had turned grey without her realizing it. Downstairs, the Comte stopped among the white roses, raising his face to the night sky, and Clarisse held her breath, as if any sound could break that fragile moment, that first crack in the ice that surrounded her. Morning came to Lady Harbury's estate with that quality of light only June can produce in England, all golden and gentle, making the gardens seem hand-painted. Clarisse woke to the singing of blackbirds and lay there for a few minutes watching how the light filtered through the muslin curtains, drew patterns on the ceiling. There was something different about that morning, a feeling she could not name, as if the air had changed density overnight. Then she remembered. She remembered amber-flecked green eyes, a husky voice pronouncing words that still echoed somewhere deep in her mind. "I have long ceased to believe in honors, mademoiselle, but I believe in what I see." She turned onto her side, pressing her face against the cool pillow, and felt something strange tighten her chest. It wasn't discomfort exactly. It was more like something dormant inside her had been touched and now refused to go back to sleep. Her lady's maid, Mrs. Dawson, entered with the silent efficiency of one who had served the Pemberton family for 2 decades, bringing warm water scented with lavender for her morning toilette and the dress carefully chosen for breakfast. It was a clear muslin outfit, with delicate peach-toned embroidery, modest as befitted the morning, but which enhanced the rosy tone of her fair skin and made her green eyes seem even more luminous. As Mrs. Dawson helped her dress, pinning her red hair in a soft arrangement that left a few curls framing her delicate face, Clarisse realized that her thoughts kept returning to the previous night, to the way the French Comte had remained silent throughout almost the entire dinner, but how that silence seemed more eloquent than all the polite conversations around. To her eyes there was an air of mystery that surrounded him and brought a certain fascination from which she could not detach herself. The breakfast room was already lively when she descended. Lady Harbury presided over the table with her usual elegance, distributing witty comments between bites of toast and jam. There were other guests, Lady Sabine Ashford, Clarisse's maternal cousin, a 22-year-old with dark brown hair and penetrating eyes that always seemed to see more than they should, young Mr. Edmund Fairfax, known for his frustrated attempts at romantic poetry, and two other ladies, whose names Clarisse always mixed up. Hawthorne was already there, of course. He always arrived early to everything, as if punctuality were yet another weapon in his arsenal of calculated perfection. He rose when she entered, making a bow that was impeccable in its execution, but which somehow managed to feel more like a public demonstration than a genuine gesture of courtesy. "Lady Clarisse," he said, and there was ownership in the way he pronounced her name, as if in saying it he already exercised some right over her. "I was beginning to worry. You rarely sleep so late." It wasn't late. The wall clock showed only 8:15 in the morning, but Clarisse had already learned that comments like those were not innocent observations. They were subtle reminders that he watched her, always, cataloguing every deviation from the standard as evidence to be potentially used later. "The country air must have done me good," she replied, allowing him to lead her to the chair beside him. "I slept deeply." Sabine shot her a quick glance over her. Teacup, a silent question that Clarisse could not interpret. Her cousin had always been more perceptive than comfortable, capable of reading between the lines of conversations and sensing tensions others deliberately ignored. There was a reason why Sabine, even with good lineage and a respectable dowry, remained unmarried at 22. She simply refused to feign contentment where there was none. Lady Harbury was about to comment on a planned outing for that afternoon when the sound of horses' hooves and wheels on gravel announced someone's arrival. Moments later, the drawing-room door opened with more vigor than usual, and a gentleman entered, bringing with him an aura that immediately altered the atmosphere of the room. "Lady Harbury," he exclaimed in impeccable English but with a deliberately exaggerated French accent for comedic effect. "Forgive this morning invasion, but I promised my melancholic friend I wouldn't let him wither alone amongst foreigners, even if those foreigners are as charming as yourself." He was a man of approximately 30, perhaps a little less, with nearly golden blonde hair casually slicked back, bright blue eyes that seemed constantly amused by some private joke, and a smile that suggested he knew exactly the effect he created. He wore impeccably elegant travel clothes, but with that touch of purposeful disarray that only the French truly managed to execute. A cravat tied with studied precision to appear careless, a deep blue silk waistcoat that perfectly matched his eyes. Lady Harbury rose with a genuine laugh, extending both hands. "Lucien Beaumont, you charming rogue, you should have announced your coming. I would have prepared your favorite room." "And miss the opportunity to surprise you?" "Never." He kissed both her hands with a theatricality that bordered on parody, but which somehow remained charming. "Besides, where is the adventure in sending letters?" "The adventure," Lady Harbury replied dryly, "is in not finding your room occupied by someone else." "Ah, but I have absolute faith in your legendary hospitality." He winked, then swept the room with those curious blue eyes, clearly assessing every person present with the speed of one accustomed to reading social rooms like others read books. Lady Harbury proceeded with introductions with her usual efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Monsieur Lucien Beaumont, Vicomte Montfort, an old family friend who apparently believes that good manners include showing up unannounced at someone else's breakfast. The best surprises," Lucien declared as he greeted each person, "are always the unannounced ones. Lord Hawthorne," he bowed to Clarisse's fiancé with courtesy that had a slightly sharp edge, "I have heard of your properties. Impressive, they say." Hawthorne returned the bow stiffly. "Monsieur Beaumont, welcome." When Lucien reached Clarisse, something in his blue eyes subtly changed. The amusement remained, but there was now a layer of more serious evaluation underneath. "Lady Clarisse Pemberton," he said, and there was an unexpected delicacy in the way he pronounced her name. "It is a pleasure to meet Lord Hawthorne's bride. Lady Harbury's gardens are known for their beauty." He hesitated deliberately, His gaze swept over all the young ladies present, and he turned back to Clarisse, a smile playing on his lips. But it seems the most remarkable Flora is indoors, receiving the most beautiful ladies. It was a compliment that bordered on impropriety, but said with such lightness that it would be impossible to confront him without seeming severe. Clarisse felt herself blush slightly, not knowing how to respond. It was Sabine who intervened, her voice carrying amusement. "Monsieur Beaumont, I fear your charm will be wasted here. My cousin is promised, and I am immune to charming Frenchmen." Lucien turned to her with genuine interest. "Immune? What a tragedy, and you are Lady Sabine Ashford, Lady Clarisse's cousin, and unlike her, completely free of romantic engagements." "Completely free," Lucien repeated, as if testing the words. "That's an interesting choice of phrase. It suggests liberation rather than availability." Sabine smiled, and there was approval in that smile. "I see you are as perceptive as you are charming, Vicomte. A terrible flaw, according to my mother. She always said I should learn to see less and pretend more." He accepted the chair a footman offered him, positioning himself to have a view of the entire table. "So, Lady Harbury, where is my sombre friend this morning? Don't tell me he's still riding alone like a restless soul through your woods." "He left at dawn," Lady Harbury replied, pouring tea for the newcomer. "But he should return at any moment." "Of course he left at dawn," Lucien sighed dramatically. "Étienne was always like that. Even when we were boys and I tried to convince him to steal sweets from the kitchen, he preferred to wake up early to— what was it? Ah, yes. Watch the sunrise and contemplate the nature of existence. At 12 years old. Imagine." There was polite laughter around the table, but Clarisse realized that beneath the humor there was something more, genuine affection, a carefully disguised concern. This man knew the Comte de Montclair in a way that went far beyond superficial friendship. "And the war?" Mr. Fairfax asked with the lack of tact characteristic of young men who had never seen battle. "Did you serve together?" Lucien's face did not change its cheerful expression, but Clarisse saw something harden in his eyes for a split second. "We served, we survived, and now we are trying to remember how to live instead of just existing. Some of us," he added with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "are more successful at that than others." It was at that moment that Étienne de Valois entered the room. Clarisse did not need to look to know it was him. She felt his arrival as a change in the air temperature, a sudden awareness of presence that made her breathing hesitate. When she finally allowed herself to look up, she found him standing in the entrance, his brown hair slightly disheveled by the riding wind, still wearing his dark riding coat, his boots still bearing traces of road dust. "Lucien," he said, and there was something in his voice, relief perhaps, or resignation, or both. "I should have guessed you wouldn't resist." "Resist?" Lucien stood up, moving to embrace his friend with that informality that only decades of friendship allows. "Mon ami, did you truly believe I would let you face English society without reinforcements? I am many things, but disloyal is not among them." There was a moment when the two men simply looked at each other, and Clarisse realized that an entire conversation was taking place there in silence, questions asked and answered, concerns expressed and acknowledged. Then Lucien stepped back, the smile returning to his face. "Besides," he continued, turning to the table, "I heard Lady Harbury is gathering the most interesting members of society, and I could not miss the opportunity to observe my melancholic friend trying to navigate civilized conversations about weather and fox hunting." "I sit in silence," Étienne replied dryly, moving to greet Lady Harbury. "It is a highly effective strategy." "Effective for what? Convincing everyone you are a particularly well-dressed statue?" Lucien turned to the group. "Forgive him, please. Étienne believes words are a finite resource that must be saved for truly important occasions, such as," he feigned thought, "never, apparently." There was polite laughter, including a soft one from Lady Harbury, and Clarisse saw something extraordinary. A ghost of a smile touched Étienne's lips for a split second, before vanishing. It wasn't a full smile, it wasn't joy, but it was more expression than she had seen him display so far. His eyes met hers at that moment, and Clarisse felt that strange sensation of recognition again, that inexplicable connection that made her forget to breathe. He inclined his head in a silent bow. "Lady Clarisse," he said, and the way he pronounced her name was completely different from Hawthorne's. There was no possession there. There was something more delicate, almost reverent, as if the name were a fragile thing he feared breaking by holding it. Comte de Montclair, she replied, and had to look away because sustaining that eye contact any longer seemed dangerous in a way she could not articulate. Hawthorne stiffened beside her. She didn't see him do it, but she felt the change in his body, the way his muscles tensed, how his shoulder pressed against hers almost imperceptibly, but definitely deliberately. It was a territorial gesture, primitive in its simplicity. Lucien, of course, noticed everything. His blue eyes slid quickly between Clarisse, Étienne, and Hawthorne, and something in his expression suggested he was filing away those observations for later analysis. But when he spoke, his voice remained lightly amused. "Étienne, sit down and eat something before you faint. You were always terrible at remembering to eat when you are contemplative." Breakfast proceeded with the conversation revolving around innocuous topics. The weather, plans for the afternoon, comments on the London season that was coming to an end. But now there was a new dynamic at the table. Lucien commanded attention with witty stories about Paris, about life in a France trying to rebuild after years of war, about eccentric characters he had met on his travels, and somehow, with subtle skill, he diverted attention whenever Hawthorne tried to dominate the conversation, whenever Clarisse's fiancé started directing, controlling comments toward her. "Lady Clarisse," Lucien said at one point, when Hawthorne was distracted by a conversation about horses with Mr. Fairfax, "I hear you play the piano. Is that true?" Clarisse hesitated, feeling the weight of Hawthorne's gaze even before he fully turned to her. Yes, a little." "A little," Sabine intervened, and there was defiance in her voice. "Clarisse is excellent. Our grandmother used to say she played as if the music belonged to her." It was when Lady Harbury mentioned the possibility of Clarisse playing the piano later that Hawthorne decided to intervene. His hand landed on hers where it rested on the table, his fingers closing around her wrist with a pressure that was too strong to be affectionate. "Clarisse does not like to play in public," he declared, and his tone allowed no discussion. "She is too modest about her talents and prefers to reserve them for more intimate occasions." It wasn't true. Clarisse liked to play, found solace in the ivory keys, in the way music could express things words could not. But she had learned in recent weeks that her preferences mattered less than the image Hawthorne had decided to construct of her, a perfect, modest, silent, ornamental bride. "What a pity," Lady Harbury commented, and there was a cold note in her voice that Clarisse recognized as contained disapproval. The Countess had eyes too sharp not to notice the way Hawthorne's fingers enclosed her wrist, in a gesture meant to pass for amiable, but which conveyed silent authority. Across the table, Sabine placed her teacup back on the saucer with a deliberate clatter, her gaze fixed on her potential brother-in-law with something dangerously close to hostility. But it was Étienne who truly saw. Clarisse noticed the exact moment his gaze dropped to where Hawthorne was holding her wrist, saw how something flashed in those amber-flecked green eyes, a brief gleam of something dark and dangerous that disappeared as quickly as it had arisen, replaced again by that mask of controlled courtesy. Lucien saw it too. Clarisse noticed by the way he paused mid-sentence how his blue eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before resuming his expression of casual amusement. "Well," Lucien said with studied lightness, "perhaps Lady Clarisse will allow us to hear her art on a future occasion when she feels more comfortable. Music, after all, should be shared when the heart desires, not when etiquette demands." There were layers to those words too, a subtle challenge to Hawthorne's statement disguised as agreement. The fiancé clearly realized it, because his fingers tightened even harder before finally releasing Clarisse's wrist. After breakfast, as the gentlemen dispersed and the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, Sabine managed to maneuver herself to walk beside Clarisse down the corridor. "Are you all right?" her cousin asked in a low voice, lightly touching her arm. Clarisse forced a smile. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Sabine stopped, turning to face her fully. "Clarisse, we are cousins. We grew up together. Do you think I don't see what is happening?" "Nothing is happening. He does not treat you with the care he should." It was not a question. "I saw how you are holding your wrist. I saw how pale you go when he approaches. And I am not the only one who noticed." Clarisse felt tears stinging her eyes but refused to let them fall. "What do you want me to do, Sabine? The engagement has been announced. My father has already spent the money Hawthorne advanced. If I break it now, your father will have to return the money, Sabine completed, her voice softening. I know. But Clarisse, do you understand what you're about to do? It is not just the wedding. It is an entire lifetime. I know. The words came out as a whisper. Believe me, I know. Sabine held both of her hands, squeezing them gently. Then why don't you fight? Why do you simply accept it? Because there is no choice, Clarisse replied, and there was defeat in those words. Because the options given to us are always limited and almost never truly depend on us. That is not true. I chose. You can choose because your father is alive and rich enough to support your independence. Mine is desperate, and I am his only solution. Clarisse pulled her hands back, wrapping her arms around herself. Don't ask me to be brave when courage will cost my family's ruin. Sabine remained silent for a long moment, then pulled Clarisse into a tight hug. It's all right, she whispered, but I want you to know that if you ever decide to fight, you won't be alone. I will be by your side, always. Clarisse hugged her back, allowing herself that moment of comfort before stepping away and recomposing her mask of serenity. I should retrieve a lighter shawl before the outing. The sun is getting strong. It was then that Hawthorne caught up with her in the hallway, appearing with that unsettling ability he had to materialize when she least expected him. We need to talk, he said, and it was not a request. His hand closed around her elbow, guiding her seemingly politely, but internally his will was to drag her into a recess beneath the staircase where no one could easily see them. Clarisse's heart raced, but not in the romantic way the books described. It was fear, pure and simple, the kind of fear that comes with the recognition of one's own vulnerability. Adrian, she began, trying to keep her voice steady. No. He cut her off before she could continue, his fingers squeezing her arm hard enough to leave marks beneath the fabric. You will listen to me. I noticed how you looked at that Frenchman at breakfast. I noticed how he looked at you. And now another one appears, paying you inappropriate compliments while you blush like a foolish girl. It was nothing. Do not take me for a fool, Clarisse. His voice was low, controlled, but carried a firm warning. I am your fiancé. In 6 weeks, I will be your husband. And when that happens, you will understand that discipline and discretion are essential virtues in a wife. Do not force me to have unpleasant conversations about this. She swallowed hard, feeling tears stinging her eyes, but refusing to let them fall. She would not give him that satisfaction. I understand. You understand? He leaned closer, and she could feel his breath on her face, see the small lines of cruelty around his mouth. I hope so. Because if any scandal tarnishes this engagement, if any inappropriate behavior of yours brings shame to my family, I assure you that your father's situation would be deeply affected, and you would realize that I can be much more inflexible than I appear. Then, as suddenly as he had grasped her, he released her, smoothing the folds of his own coat as if nothing had happened. His face transformed again into that mask of courteous perfection, the practiced smile returning to his lips as if operated by invisible strings. Come, he said, extending his arm in a parody of chivalry. The others are waiting, my lovely bride. Clarisse had to follow, forcing her trembling legs to move, forcing her face to compose some semblance of serenity. But when they emerged into the daylight, joining the group already gathering in the gardens, she felt as if she had just stepped out of a cave and the light hurt her. Lady Harbury noticed immediately. Her knowing eyes swept Clarisse's face, then Hawthorne's, and something in her expression hardened. But she said nothing, merely moving to place herself between them with the subtlety of a general reorganizing troops. Lord Hawthorne, she announced with that benevolent authority that admitted no refusal, you must accompany Lady Catherine and her mother. They expressed a particular interest in discussing pheasant rearing, and I know your property is notable in that regard. Then turning to Clarisse with a smile that was both gentle and strategic, Lady Clarisse, dear, you will walk with me. She held Clarisse gently by the arm, drawing her away from her fiancé. And I believe the Comte de Montclair would appreciate hearing your impressions of the gardens. He has shown interest in English botany. Monsieur Beaumont, you will accompany us too. I must hear more about those Parisian adventures of yours. It was thus with the mastery of one who orchestrates social movements like pieces on a chessboard that Lady Harbury separated Clarisse from Hawthorne and, seemingly by chance, created a small group that included the red-haired young woman, the silent Comte and his witty friend as they walked the gravel paths that wound among rose beds and lavender borders. Étienne walked beside them in silence for a few minutes, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze seemingly focused on the landscape. Lucien, for his part, maintained an animated conversation with Lady Harbury about the differences between French and English gardens, but Clarisse perceived that he, too, was watching, not just her, but primarily his friend. Noticing every glance Étienne directed toward the red-haired young woman, every moment he seemed to want to say something, but restrained himself. But Clarisse also perceived that Étienne was watching her peripherally, noticing every small detail, the way she kept her left arm discreetly rigid, hiding the discomfort caused by her fiancé's overly firm gestures, the pallor she hadn't managed to completely disguise, the way her eyes darted away whenever Hawthorne, ahead with the other ladies, turned to look back. It was Lady Harbury who broke the silence, pointing to a particularly exuberant rosebush with apricot-coloured blossoms. This variety came from France, did you know? A gift from a dear friend many years ago. They are more delicate than the English ones, require extra care, but when they bloom, she smiled, lightly touching a petal. When they bloom, there is nothing more beautiful. There were layers to those words, Clarisse knew. Lady Harbury rarely said something that had only one meaning. Beauty that requires protection is not weakness, Étienne said suddenly, his voice low but clear. It is merely recognition that not every environment is suitable for certain things to flourish. Lady Harbury turned to him with a look that was almost maternal, briefly touching his arm. Exactly, mon cher. Exactly. How profound, mon ami, Lucien commented with that tone of humor that had a serious edge. Almost poetic. Be careful, or people will start to think you have feelings. Étienne shot him a look that would have frozen a less intimate man, but Lucien merely smiled wider. They continued walking, and somehow Clarisse never knew exactly how it happened. Lady Harbury found herself briefly distracted by Lady Sabine, who called her a few steps ahead to ask something about the peonies. Lucien, with perfect timing, feigned extreme interest in a garden sculpture and moved a few yards away, leaving Clarisse and Étienne momentarily alone as they walked side by side. Was it accidental or deliberate? Clarisse suspected the latter, and suspected that both Lady Harbury and Lucien were complicit in this subtle orchestration, which meant that, for a precious and dangerous moment, she was alone with the Comte de Montclair, just the two of them walking side by side as the others drifted slightly away. The silence between them was different from the silence Clarisse knew with Hawthorne. It was not oppressive or loaded with implicit threats. It was almost comfortable, as if words were optional instead of obligatory. "Your roses," he said finally, breaking that silence carefully, like one testing the ice before. "Crossing a frozen lake. On your property, Lady Clarisse. Do you cultivate them?" The question was so unexpected, so genuinely curious without being intrusive, that Clarisse found herself answering before thinking. "I used to. My mother had a lovely garden and taught me the names of every variety. She said that plants were like people. Some needed constant sun, others preferred the shade, but all needed strong roots. Your mother is wise." She was. The word came out soft, without the sharp pain that usually accompanied it. "She passed away when I was 14. Étienne stopped walking. He turned to face her completely, and there was something in his amber-flecked green eyes, a deep understanding that did not come from superficial sympathy, but from genuine recognition. "Then you know what it is to carry absences." It was not a question, it was a statement, and Clarisse understood at that moment that he too carried absences, so many that they probably no longer fit inside him, overflowing from the corners of his soul. "Yes," she whispered, "I know." They stood there, facing each other on the gravel path, surrounded by the scent of roses and the distant buzz of bees. Any observer would say they did not touch, that they maintained the perfectly respectable distance that etiquette demanded, but Clarisse felt as if something had stretched out between them, invisible but real, a connection that had no name but existed all the same. There was something in the way he looked at her, not with the poorly disguised eagerness of men who see women as prizes, nor with the polite indifference of empty courtesy. It was as if he truly saw her, every layer, every hidden wound, every suffocated dream. And instead of recoiling from it, instead of being frightened by that unsolicited intimacy, Clarisse found herself wanting to be seen, wanting someone, finally, to witness who she really was beneath all those carefully constructed masks. "My brothers," Étienne said suddenly, his voice so low she had to lean slightly to hear. "I lost 2 of them at Waterloo, and my mother. She survived the war, but did not survive the grief. So, yes, Lady Clarisse, I know absences. I know how they occupy more space than presences ever did." Clarisse felt something tighten in her chest, a wave of compassion so intense it almost brought her down. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am deeply sorry. Do not be sorry." His eyes met hers, and there was something burning in that green gaze, something that was not desire exactly, but which was equally intense. "Just understand. Understand that when I see someone being diminished, when I see light being purposely extinguished." He stopped as if he had said too much, as if he had crossed some invisible line he had promised himself not to cross. Then Hawthorne called her name, too loudly for the elegance of the garden, and the moment shattered like glass. Later, as the group was returning to the house for luncheon, Clarisse passed an open second-floor window and heard male voices coming from inside. The library, probably. She did not intend to listen, but immediately recognized one as belonging to Étienne, and the other was Lucien, speaking in French with that accent even more pronounced now that there was no English audience. "Mon Dieu, Étienne," Lucien was saying, and all the humor had vanished from his voice, replaced by genuine concern. "You stood watching that English girl as if she were the first flower of spring after a long winter. I am not blind." "Lucien," Étienne's voice carried a warning. "No, no, let me speak. I have known you since we were 10 years old. I saw you cross Waterloo. I saw you bury your brothers. I saw you transform into this ghost of a man who does not smile, who does not feel. You have become a shadow, mon ami, a shadow that breathes but does not live." And then, in a single breakfast, I see you look at a young woman as if what? There was a silence, then, as if she could give you back something you thought you lost in the war. Another silence, longer. When Étienne spoke again, his voice came out lower, huskier, loaded with something that made Clarisse's heart ache painfully. "There are things that should not be said to a lady. Not in this way." "Her fiancé, you mean?" "Yes. I saw there is something wrong there. In the way he holds her, in the way she wilts when he approaches, like someone being gradually suffocated by others' expectations. And what do you intend to do about it?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Clarisse held her breath, waiting, not even knowing why she waited, not even knowing what she wanted to hear. "Nothing," Étienne said finally, and the word sounded like defeat. "I am no hero, Lucien. This war has already stripped me of the illusion that I can save anyone. I can barely save myself. And she—" his voice cracked slightly. "She is promised, committed. Her destiny has already been decided by people who are not me. Destinies can be changed, not by broken men who cannot even remember how to smile." There was a deep bitterness in those words. What could I offer her but more darkness? She deserves light, Lucien. She deserves someone who can give her joy, instead of merely recognizing the absence of it. And this Hawthorne, do you think he will give her light? No, but that does not mean I can. A heavy sigh. Besides, I have no right. I have no right to desire something that belongs to another man, no matter how wrong that belonging may be. Lucien made a sound of frustration. You and your damned honor, even after everything, even after seeing how war makes honor a convenient illusion, you still cling to it as if it were real. Because if I let go, Étienne replied with a terrible quietness, there will be nothing left of me worth preserving. Clarisse moved away from the window with her heart pounding too hard, confused by a storm of emotions she could not untangle. Sadness, because she had heard the deep exhaustion in his voice, disappointment, for reasons she did not want to examine, and something else, something dangerous and forbidden that she should not feel, but which grew nonetheless, like climbing vines that do not ask permission to climb walls. That night, lying in her bed, as the moon cast silver shadows across the room, Clarisse lightly touched the wrist where Hawthorne had grasped her. There would be no visible marks. He was too careful for that, but she felt them anyway, invisible impressions that burned like reminders. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the future that awaited her in 6 weeks, an entire life beside a man who treated her as property, who saw obedience as the greatest virtue, who squeezed too tight and smiled the wrong way, an entire life being pruned and shaped, until nothing of her remained recognizable. And then, without asking permission, another image intruded. Amber-flecked green eyes that truly saw her, a husky voice that pronounced her name as if it were precious, hands that she imagined would touch with reverence instead of possession, a man broken by war, but who still recognized beauty when he saw it, who still understood that some flowers needed protection to flourish. She turned onto her side, pressing her face against the pillow, and allowed a single silent tear to slide down her cheek, because she already knew, with the terrible clarity of certain inconvenient truths, that something had begun, something that should not, that could not, but which was already growing like those French roses in Lady Harbury's garden, delicate, beautiful, and completely unsuitable for the soil where it was trying to bloom. And somewhere in the hallway, in a dark room lit only by the moon, Étienne de Valois, Comte Montclair, was awake too, staring at the ceiling and wondering how something that should be impossible could seem for the first time in years, like the only thing that made sense in a world that had long ceased to have any. Lady Harbury's estate awoke the next morning shrouded in mist, that English fog that transforms gardens into dreamscapes and makes the world seem suspended between reality and imagination. Clarisse watched from her bedroom window while Mrs. Dawson arranged her red hair in intertwined braids that coiled at the nape of her neck, leaving a few loose curls framing her face. There was something hypnotic about that fog, in the way it obscured the boundaries between things, making everything soft and undefined. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that husky voice again saying words not meant for her. She deserves light. She deserves someone who can give her joy instead of merely recognizing the absence of it. And each time her heart tightened with a mix of pain and something more dangerous, hope, perhaps, or the recognition that she was not alone in her prison of suffocating obligations and expectations. "Lady Clarisse," Mrs. Dawson said gently, noticing how the young woman's fingers trembled slightly. "Is everything all right? You seem tired." "I'm fine," Clarisse lied, forcing a smile. "Just, the air here is different. I'm still getting used to it." It was not the air. It was everything else. The way Lady Harbury's estate seemed to exist outside the normal rules of society, as if those lands were neutral territory where impossible things could, for a few days, pretend to be possible. When she descended for breakfast, she found Lady Harbury already settled in her usual chair, but this time there were only she, Sabine, and two other ladies in the room. The gentlemen apparently had gone out early, some for riding, others for a visit to neighboring properties. "Ah, my dear, lady." Harbury greeted her with that smile that always seemed to know more than it should. "Come, sit down. The men decided they needed masculine activities this morning, which leaves us in peace to conspire properly." Sabine laughed, biting into a piece of toast. "Conspire, Lady Harbury? What an interesting word. I prefer strategically organize, but conspire has a more amusing sound, don't you think?" The Countess poured tea for Clarisse with her own hands, a gesture of familiarity that was both an honor and an intimacy. "I have plans for this afternoon, a small musical soirée. Nothing too elaborate, just a few close friends, pleasant music, perhaps a few dances. Clarisse, dear, I have heard from very reliable sources that you play the piano wonderfully." Clarisse felt herself stiffen. "Lord Hawthorne prefers that I do not—" "Lord Hawthorne," Lady Harbury interrupted with a gentleness that had edges of steel, "is not my guest this afternoon. He and Lord Harrington have been invited to dine at the Ashworth property. Business matters, you understand, which means you, my dear, are free from certain restrictions for a few precious hours." Clarisse's eyes widened. "But I cannot. He will expect you to remain here under my supervision, behaving as a young lady should." Lady Harbury smiled, and there was something almost maternal in that smile, but there was also the astuteness of a seasoned strategist. "And that is exactly what you will do. It just so happens that young ladies under appropriate supervision are perfectly capable of playing the piano, conversing with other guests, and enjoying a civilized afternoon without that constituting any kind of impropriety." Sabine watched the exchange with growing interest, her intelligent eyes moving between the Countess and her cousin. "Lady Harbury," she said slowly, "may I ask who else will be present at this soirée?" "Oh, just a few acquaintances." "Monsieur Beaumont, certainly." He promised to entertain us with stories about the Parisian opera, Lady Catherine and her daughter. Young Mr. Fairfax, of course, although his attempts at poetry are more courageous than successful. And the Comte de Montclair mentioned that he would like to hear some English music, as he has spent so much time away from any kind of civilization. The name hung in the air like the mist outside, soft but impossible to ignore. Clarisse felt her heart race, and she hated herself for it, hated that the simple mention of him was enough to make her pulse quicken. "I see," Sabine said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood much more than was being said. "It sounds like a lovely afternoon." Lady Harbury set her cup back on the saucer with a delicate click. "Clarisse, may I be frank with you?" The young woman nodded, unable to speak. "I have lived long enough," the Countess began, her voice losing its lightness and gaining weight, "to recognize certain situations. I have eyes, my dear, and those eyes have seen things that have left me profoundly worried." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "Your fiancé is a man of impeccable reputation, that is true. But reputation and character do not always go hand in hand, and I would be negligent as a hostess and as someone who cares about you if I did not create opportunities for you to breathe. Just breathe for a few hours, without feeling that constant weight." Tears stung Clarisse's eyes. No one had said it out loud before. No one had acknowledged that weight, that constant pressure that made her feel as though she were being slowly crushed. "I cannot," she started, but her voice failed. "You can," Lady Harbury said firmly, reaching out to cover her hand. "For one afternoon, you can. And no one, not even Lord Hawthorne, can criticize you for attending a perfectly respectable event under my supervision. I will see to it." Sabine also reached out her hand, creating a silent chain of feminine solidarity around the table. "You are not alone, Clarisse. Not here. Not with us." The afternoon arrived, still wrapped in that persistent mist that gave everything a dreamlike quality. Lady Harbury's music room was a magnificent room, all in shades of cream and gold, with tall windows that normally poured in light, but which today filtered only that diffuse, soft luminosity. The piano, a magnificent dark wood Broadwood, occupied a prominent position near the windows, and chairs and sofas were arranged in a semicircle around it. Clarisse entered hesitantly, her fingers intertwined in front of her body, wearing an afternoon dress in a soft shade of green that Sabine had insisted she wear. "It brings out your eyes," her cousin had said, but Clarisse suspected there were other reasons. The green made her look less like the demure, controlled bride Hawthorne was, moulding and more like herself, the young woman who used to run through her mother's gardens with flowers in her hair. Some guests were already present. Lady Catherine, a robust, middle-aged lady, was conversing animatedly with her daughter about something related to floral arrangements. Mr. Fairfax was leafing through a volume of poetry, with the exaggerated seriousness of one who wants to be noticed doing so. And there, near the window, Lucien Beaumont was examining a painting on the wall with apparent interest, but Clarisse noticed how his blue eyes slid toward her when she entered, how he assessed her appearance with that characteristic quickness before returning his attention to the painting. And then she saw Étienne. He was standing near the piano, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood as if testing its solidity. He wore a dark coat that accentuated the width of his shoulders, and his brown hair was simply brushed back. But it was his eyes that captured her, those amber-flecked green eyes that lifted at the exact moment she entered, as if he had sensed her presence even before seeing her. For a moment, the world narrowed down to just the two of them, she, standing at the entrance, he, motionless by the piano, and between them, something invisible but devastatingly real, a recognition, an attraction that went beyond the physical and touched something deeper, more dangerous. Then, Lucien broke the moment with his characteristically lively voice. "Ah, Lady Clarisse, finally. I was beginning to fear we would have to endure Mr. Fairfax's attempts to recite his own poetry. You have saved us from a fate worse than death." "I heard that," Mr. Fairfax protested, but without real offense. "You were meant to hear it," Lucien replied with a charming smile. "Honest criticism is a gift, not an insult." Lady Harbury entered behind Clarisse, bringing Sabine with her. "Well, now that everyone is here, we can begin. Clarisse, dear, why don't you do us the honor of playing something? Choose whatever you like, something that brings you joy." Clarisse hesitated, her eyes automatically moving to where Hawthorne would normally be, expecting that expression of disapproval, that tightening on her wrist that served as a warning, but he was not there. For the first time in weeks, she was free from that controlling gaze. She began, but her voice came out so low it could barely be heard. Play, Étienne said suddenly, his husky voice breaking the silence. Please. There was something in the way he said those words, not an order, not even a request, but almost a plea, as if he needed to hear her play, as if it were important in a way he could not explain. Clarisse walked to the piano in small steps, feeling the weight of all eyes on her, but especially his. She sat on the stool, adjusting her skirts, and for a moment simply looked at the ivory keys, at her own hands, resting upon them. It had been so long. Hawthorne did not allow her to play, saying it was an unnecessary distraction, that wives should focus on other, more practical skills. Then, slowly, she began to play. She chose a piece by Mozart, a sonata her mother adored, full of lyrical melody and gentle melancholy. Her hands remembered the path through the notes, like one remembers a long-abandoned home. The first chords came out hesitantly, but then the music took over, and she forgot everything. She forgot the audience, she forgot Hawthorne, she forgot her engagement and all the reasons why she shouldn't be there. There was only the music, the way the notes intertwined, rose and fell, told stories without words. Her fingers danced over the keys, delicate but firm, and something inside her that had been compressed for so long began to expand, to breathe. She did not realize when she closed her eyes, completely lost in the melody. She did not realize how the room had fallen into absolute silence, everyone mesmerized. She did not realize how Lucienne exchanged a meaningful look with Lady Harbury, how Sabine smiled with tears in her eyes. But she would have noticed, had she been looking, how Étienne de Valois had moved closer without thinking, how he stood just a few steps from the piano, watching her with an intensity that bordered on devotion, how his eyes traced every movement of her hands, every expression that crossed her face as she played, how something in his habitually controlled expression had fractured, allowing an emotion so raw, so deep, to show through that Lucienne had to look away because it felt invasive to witness it. The music built to its climax, then softened, descending in melancholic cascades to the final notes that hung in the air like sighs. When Clarisse finally opened her eyes, she found Étienne standing there, so close that she could see the amber flecks in his green eyes, could see how his breathing was slightly altered, as if the music had physically affected him. "Mademoiselle," he said, and his voice came out husky, loaded with contained emotion. "That was—" He paused, seeming unable to find suitable English words, then switched to French. "C'était magnifique. Vous êtes magnifique." Clarisse felt the blush rising on her cheeks, felt as though those words touched her more intimately than any physical contact could. There was something in the way he looked at her now, as if he finally understood something he had been searching for unknowingly. "Bravo!" Lucienne exclaimed, breaking the moment with enthusiastic applause. "Bravo! See, Étienne, I told you it was worth coming. That was extraordinary, Lady Clarisse. Absolutely extraordinary." The others joined in the applause, and Clarisse had to stand up, make graceful curtsies, accept compliments while her heart was still beating too fast and her eyes kept returning, against her will, to where Étienne remained. Motionless, watching her with that expression she could not fully decipher, but which made her feel as though she were being seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Lady Harbury moved with the grace of a mistress of ceremonies. "Wonderful, dear. Absolutely wonderful. Now how about refreshments? And afterwards perhaps we could have a few dances. Nothing too formal, just a little fun among friends." As servants brought in trays of lemonade and small cakes, Lady Harbury orchestrated the arrangement of the room with masterful subtlety. Chairs were moved, space was created, and somehow, always somehow, Clarisse found herself near Étienne, separated only by the socially acceptable width, but close enough that she could feel his presence as warmth. "You truly play beautifully," he said quietly, speaking only to her while the others conversed around them. "How did your mother teach you?" The question was so gentle, so genuinely interested, that Clarisse felt her defenses lower. She used to say that music was the language of the soul, that when words failed, melodies could say what needed to be said. She looked at her own hands, remembering. I used to play for her every night before bed. Even when she was too ill to leave it, she always asked me to play. And did you play? On the night she... Yes. The word came out as a whisper. I played until her fingers stopped squeezing mine, and after that, I couldn't play for nearly a year. Every note seemed to bring back that night. Étienne was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of shared experience. I know that pain. After Waterloo, after burying my brothers, I couldn't look at the sky for months. They loved astronomy, you know. We used to lie in the fields at night identifying constellations, and then... He stopped, his jaw clenching. Afterwards, every star seemed like an accusation. Why did I survive when they did not? Clarisse turned to face him completely, forgetting for a moment where they were, who might be watching. It was not your fault. It was not your fault either, he replied, and there was something devastating in the way his eyes met hers. That your mother left. That you need to carry that loss. None of this is your fault, Lady Clarisse. She felt tears sting, but blinked rapidly to clear them away. Sometimes, she whispered, I feel that if I had been better, more worthy of her, love perhaps she would have fought harder to stay. No, Étienne said with surprising firmness. Do not think that. Never think that. He hesitated, then added so low she almost didn't hear, You are more than worthy. Of love, of joy, of everything this world can offer. Anyone who does not see that is a fool. She placed her hand in Lucien's and allowed him to lead her to the open space where other couples were already beginning to form. The music was a simple waltz, suitable for an informal afternoon, and Lucien danced with that natural ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. You know, Lucien murmured as they twirled, his voice so low that only she could hear. I have known Étienne since we were 10 years old. I have seen him through all manner of situations, joys, losses, battles that would leave smaller men broken. Clarisse did not reply, but felt her heart tighten. And in all these years, he continued, guiding her through a turn with studied grace, I have learned to recognize certain changes in him. The way his posture relaxes minimally when something genuinely captures his attention. The way his eyes lose that distant quality that the war left behind. He paused significantly. I haven't seen that in a long time, until recently. Monsieur Beaumont, she began, but her voice failed. I am not suggesting anything improper, Lady Clarisse, he said gently, but there was an unusual seriousness in his habitually cheerful tone. I merely observe that there are rare moments in life when something awakens in us what we thought was lost. For some, it might be music. For others, the beauty of a garden at dawn. And for some, he left the sentence hanging, eloquent in its silence. Clarisse felt tears threatening to spill over. But it does not matter, does it? What may or may not awaken in someone when there is no possible path? Perhaps not, Lucien agreed softly. But even when paths are closed, the simple fact of feeling again, of recognizing that we are still capable of feeling, that in itself has value. It reminds us that we are alive. His blue eyes met hers with genuine compassion. And both you and he, it seems to me, needed to be reminded of that. The music ended, and Lucien led her back to where Sabine and Lady Harbury were conversing. But before fully releasing her, he leaned in and whispered, Just be gentle with your own heart, Lady Clarisse. And if you can with his as well. There are wounds that never fully heal, but a little care can make them more bearable. The following hours passed in a succession of polite conversations and soft music. Étienne danced once with Lady Catherine, fulfilling social obligations, but Clarisse noticed, because now she could not notice, how his gaze would drift in her direction even when he tried to keep his attention on his dance partner. And every time their eyes met across the room, even briefly, Clarisse felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of pain and something dangerously close to hope. It was as the afternoon began to fade into twilight that Lady Harbury suggested a walk through the gardens for those who wished. The mist is lifting, she announced, and the sunset promises to be spectacular. Clarisse found herself walking between Sabine and Lady Catherine, listening to the conversation, but not truly participating, her mind still processing Lucien's words, the persistent feeling that something fundamental had changed inside her without her knowing exactly when. Then Sabine was called back to the house by a footman, something about an urgent message, and Lady Catherine decided the air was too damp for her joints, leaving Clarisse momentarily alone, on a path lined with tall hedges. Not so alone, she realized a moment later. Étienne emerged from a side path, and when their eyes met, both stopped. The garden around them was empty, everyone else still on the terrace or already returning to the house. It was profoundly improper, the two of them alone without a chaperone, but neither of them moved to correct the situation. "Lady Clarisse," he said, and there was hesitation in his voice, as if he also knew they were crossing dangerous lines. "Lady Clarisse," he said, and there was hesitation in his voice, as if he also knew they were crossing dangerous lines. I did not plan to be here. I was not following you. I was merely—" "I know," she interrupted softly. "I did not plan it either." They stood there, the silence between them heavy with all the things they could not say. The twilight light painted everything in shades of gold and rose, and there was something in the quality of that light that made the moment seem suspended in time, as if they existed in some space between worlds where normal rules did not apply. Clarisse watched how the last lights of day touched his face, softening the lines of tension that habitually marked his features. There was a vulnerable quality to his expression now, something he normally kept hidden beneath layers of careful control, and she realized, with a clarity that frightened her, that she could spend hours simply looking at him, memorizing every detail, the way his brown hair fell lightly over his forehead, the small lines around his eyes that spoke of witnessed pain, the curve of his mouth that rarely smiled, but which she imagined, in secret moments, how it would look if he smiled at her. "When you played today," Étienne said finally, his voice so husky that she could barely hear him, "it was the first time in years that I felt—" He stopped, as if searching for words that could contain what he was trying to express. "It was as if something inside me, something that was frozen, began to thaw. And it hurt, Lady Clarisse. It hurt in a way I did not expect." She took a step closer without thinking, drawn by that raw honesty. "It hurt?" "Yes." His amber-flecked green eyes met hers, and there was so much emotion there that Clarisse had to hold her breath. "Because it is easier to feel nothing. Safer. When you don't feel, you cannot be disappointed. You cannot lose more than you have already lost. But then you started playing, and every note was like—" He paused, visibly struggling with words. It was like remembering that beauty exists in the world, and that somehow made all the absences more painful. Tears slid silently down Clarisse's cheeks, and she lowered her gaze, ashamed of that display of emotion before him. But then she saw his hand move, slow, hesitant, reaching for the inner pocket of his coat. He took out an immaculately folded white linen handkerchief, and for a moment simply held it between them, as if asking for silent permission. Clarisse lifted her eyes, meeting his again, and nodded. The movement so subtle it barely existed, but he understood. With a delicacy that contrasted sharply with his habitually tense posture, Étienne raised the handkerchief and with infinite care touched the edge of the fabric against her cheek, absorbing the tear that still shimmered there. The touch was brief, almost ethereal, but Clarisse felt as though every nerve ending in her face had awakened. Even through the thin layer of fabric, even through the kid glove he wore, she felt the warmth of his hand, the deliberate tenderness of the gesture. He moved to the other side, repeating the care, and this time his fingers lightly brushed her chin. An accident, perhaps, or perhaps not. Clarisse felt her heart race, her pulse quickening in a way that made her dizzy. It was not fear. It was not the kind of palpitation that Hawthorne provoked when he squeezed her wrist too hard, or even when he tried to be gentle. It was something else entirely, an acute awareness of every inch of space between them, of how easy it would be to eliminate that distance, of how her entire body seemed to lean toward him without conscious permission. Étienne withdrew the handkerchief slowly, but did not put it away. He simply held it, his fingers tightening the fabric, as if he needed to hold on to something tangible to keep from giving into the impulse to touch more, to get closer. His eyes never left hers, and in that gaze Clarisse saw everything he could not say. The war he was waging with himself, desire fighting against honor, need confronting impossibility. She saw even more. She saw how he looked at her not with the possessive attention she knew from Hawthorne, but with something closer to reverence, as if she were something precious and fragile that he feared breaking just by being near, as if simply being able to see her, to be there in that suspended moment, was both a blessing and a torture. The air between them vibrated with everything they could not say. Clarisse realized she was breathing irregularly, that her hands trembled slightly where she kept them intertwined in front of her body. She noticed how his eyes briefly dropped to her mouth before returning to her eyes, how he swallowed hard, how the vein in his neck visibly pulsed. He took a half step forward. She did not retreat. Now they were so close that she could see the small variations in color in his eyes, the darker green near the pupils, the golden threads that caught the twilight light. She could see how his eyelashes were surprisingly long, how there was a small, almost invisible scar just above his left eyebrow. She could smell the subtle scent he wore, something with notes of bergamot and cedar, masculine but not overwhelming, and he looked at her in the same way. His eyes traced every delicate, small freckle that dotted her nose and cheeks, the shape of her lips, the curve of her neck where it disappeared beneath the modest neckline of her dress. But there was nothing improper in that look. It was admiration, pure and simple, as if he were memorizing every detail to keep later, when distance was forced between them again. His hand moved again, and this time he did not reach for her face. Instead, slowly, giving her all the time in the world to step back if she wished, he extended his gloved hand toward hers, not to take but to offer, a silent invitation. Clarisse looked at that hand suspended in the air between them. It was improper, it was dangerous, it was everything she should not do. But then, as if her own fingers had a will of their own, she saw her right hand untangle itself from the left and move to meet his. The moment their hands touched, glove against glove, appropriate by etiquette but devastating nonetheless, Clarisse felt something shoot through her like electricity. He closed his fingers around hers with a gentleness that made her want to weep, so different from Hawthorne's overly firm squeezes, so different from any touch she had ever experienced. It was not about possession, it was about connection, about recognition, about two lonely people finding, for an impossible moment, something they didn't even know they were looking for. He did not pull her hand closer, did not bring it to his lips as would be appropriate in a formal greeting. He simply held it, his thumbs moving in a slow, hypnotic circle over her knuckles, and Clarisse found she could not look away, trapped in that green gaze that saw her, truly saw her, in a way that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and safe. The world around them disappeared. There was no longer a garden, no longer obligations or impossibilities. There was only the two of them, hands joined, gazes intertwined, breaths sinking without their realizing it. Then distant voices came from the terrace, calling them back to the real world. The sound broke the spell like shattering glass. Both blinked, returning to themselves, and Étienne released her hand, as suddenly as if he had been burned. He took a step back, then another, the expression on his face transforming into something close to contained panic. Not fear of her, Clarisse realized, but fear of himself, of what he had almost allowed to happen, of how much he had wanted to continue holding that hand and never let go. "Forgive me," he said, his voice husky now for different reasons. "I shouldn't have. That was—" But Clarisse merely shook her head slightly, unable to find words. Because what could she say? That she did not regret it, that she wished that moment had lasted longer, that for the first time in her life, she understood what people meant when they spoke of feeling alive. They turned and walked back to the house, separated by the appropriate distance, but something had irrevocably changed. They did not need words to know it. It was there in the way he kept his hands firmly clasped behind his back, as if he did not trust himself not to reach for her again. It was there in the way she still felt the ghost of that touch, as if her fingers had memorized the shape of his through the gloves, and it was there in the silent and terrible certainty that that moment in the garden, that brief and appropriate touch, had been more intimate, more significant than any stolen kiss could have been, because it had not been about physical desire, it had been about the recognition of souls, and that, both of them knew with devastating clarity, was infinitely more dangerous. Later that night, when Lord Hawthorne returned from his dinner with Lord Harrington, Clarisse was in her room, looking out the window at the gardens plunged into darkness. She heard his arrival, heard his voice in the corridor below, demanding to know where she was, whether she had behaved appropriately, and for the first time, instead of fear or resignation, she felt something different. A deep sadness, yes, but also a new clarity, the clarity of understanding exactly what she was about to lose, what she was already losing with every passing day trapped in that engagement. And somewhere on the estate, in another room lit only by the moon, Étienne de Valois, Comte Montclair, was standing by the window too. One hand pressed against the cold glass, watching the same stars she was watching. The other hand still held that linen handkerchief, now stained with her tears, and he knew he should send it to be washed. He should put it away and forget. But he would not yet at least. For now, it was all he had of a moment that should never have happened, but which, nonetheless, had become the most precious memory he carried from before the war. Some things, once started, could not simply be stopped. Some connections once forged could not be undone just because they were inconvenient or impossible, and what was growing between them, delicate, forbidden, inevitable, already had roots too deep to be simply torn out without destroying everything around. The morning of departure dawned with that soft June light that transformed Lady Harbury's estate into something out of a painting, all golden and ethereal, as if reluctant to release its guests back into the real world. The carriages were already lined up in the circular gravel courtyard, horses patiently waiting, while servants loaded trunks and bags with silent efficiency. Clarisse watched everything from her bedroom window for the last time, Mrs. Dawson finishing pinning her travelling cloak. There was something melancholic about that departure, as if she were leaving behind more than just an elegant country house. She was leaving behind something she couldn't name, a possibility perhaps, or a glimpse of how life might be different if circumstances allowed. "Are you ready, my lady?" Mrs. Dawson asked gently, noticing how the young woman's fingers squeezed the windowsill. "Yes," Clarisse replied, though she didn't feel ready at all. "Yes, I am." The courtyard was already busy when she went down. Lady Catherine and her daughter had already left, their effusive farewells still echoing in the air. Mr. Fairfax was awkwardly adjusting his luggage into a smaller carriage, while two other families conversed animatedly about plans for the London season. Lady Harbury was at the centre of everything, a masterful presence in her lavender morning gown, distributing farewells and kind words like a queen in her court. When she saw Clarisse, her eyes softened in a way that made the young woman feel a pang in her chest. "Ma chère," the Countess approached, taking both of Clarisse's hands in hers. "I sincerely hope you enjoyed your stay with us." "More than words can express, Lady Harbury," Clarisse replied, and there was profound truth in those words. "Your hospitality it was more than generous. It was liberating." Something passed across the Countess's experienced eyes, understanding perhaps, or satisfaction at a well-executed plan. "Sometimes we need spaces where we can simply breathe, dear, where we can remember who we are beyond all the roles they force us to play." She squeezed her hands lightly. "And if you ever need that space, again, my doors will always be open." Sabine joined them, already wearing her travelling cloak, her face showing the same reluctance Clarisse felt. "Lady Harbury, I don't know how to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me, my dear. Just promise me that you will continue to be the strength your cousin so needs." The Countess looked between the two young women with that expression that saw much more than it should. Look out for each other in London. The city can be unforgiving. To those who have no allies. It was then that Clarisse saw him. Étienne emerged from the house along with Lucien, both already dressed for travel. His dark coat accentuated the breadth of his shoulders, and his brown hair was brushed back with that simplicity she had begun to recognize as characteristic of him. But it was his eyes that captured her, those mysteriously perfect eyes that met hers immediately, as if they knew exactly where to look. Lucien, of course, noticed everything. His blue eyes danced between them with contained amusement, but when he spoke his voice carried only its habitual lightness. "Lady Clarisse, Lady Sabine." He made an elaborate bow that bordered on theatricality. "What a tragedy that our enchanting stay has come to an end. Now we must return to the dreary civilization of London, where Frenchmen are merely tolerated instead of properly admired." "I am sure," Sabine replied with a smile, "that London will survive the impact of your presence, Monsieur Beaumont." "It will survive, yes, but it will be infinitely more tedious." He turned to Lady Harbury with genuine affection. "Ma tante," he used the term of kinship, although they were not blood relatives. "As always, your hospitality has been unparalleled. And your company, as always, was both delightful and exasperating, mon petit diable," she replied with an affectionate smile. Étienne approached more slowly, and Clarisse saw how he kept his hands firmly, clasped behind his back, as if he did not trust himself for a closer greeting. He inclined his head to her and Sabine in a formal bow. "Lady Clarisse, Lady Sabine, I hope your journey back is peaceful." His voice was carefully neutral, but Clarisse heard the undercurrent there, all the repressed emotion, all the weight of the unspoken things. "Comte de Montclair," she replied, keeping her own voice steady with effort. "Likewise." For a moment their eyes met again, and in that gaze an entire silent conversation passed between them. Gratitude for the kindness shown, sadness for the impossibility of it all, recognition that something had irrevocably changed between them, and then he looked away, turning back to Lady Harbury. "Ma chère Agnès," he took the Countess's hands with that gentleness that contrasted with his usual rigidity. "I have no words to express my gratitude. These days were—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "They were a gift I did not know I needed." "Mon cher Étienne," Lady Harbury replied with maternal tenderness, briefly touching his face, "you carry so much within you, so much weight, so much guilt that does not belong to you. It was my joy to see, even briefly, a little of that light return to your eyes." She paused significantly. "Light always finds a way, dear, even through the deepest shadows." He nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke. "Will we see you in London?" she asked, although her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, Lucien insists I need to attend at least a few social events, or English society will decide that all Frenchmen are grumpy hermits." "Exactly," Lucien interjected cheerfully. "My reputation as a charming Frenchman cannot bear the burden of compensating for your reputation as a somber Frenchman. We need balance." "Your sacrifice is noteworthy," Étienne replied dryly, but there was the ghost of a smile in his voice. Lady Harbury laughed, then turned to Lucien. "And you, mon vilain garçon, promise to stay out of trouble, or at least away from trouble that reaches my ears. Tante, you offend me. I am the very picture of discretion and decorum. You are the very picture of a charming troublemaker, who knows exactly how much trouble he can cause before needing to make amends." But her smile was affectionate. "Look out for each other, mes garçons. And Lucien, look after him." This last part was said quietly, but Clarisse, who was close enough, heard it. "Avec mon cœur et mon âme, tante," Lucien replied with unusual seriousness, as always. It was then that Hawthorne arrived, mounted on an imposing black stallion, his posture perfectly erect, showing his equestrian skill. He dismounted with studied precision and approached the group, his eyes quickly sliding over all present before fixing on Clarisse with that possessive quality she knew so well. "Lady Harbury," he made an impeccable bow. "I thank you for your hospitality. Clarisse, Sabine, the carriage is ready. We should depart before the sun gets too strong." It was not a request. It was an order disguised as practical concern. Clarisse saw Sabine stiffen beside her, saw how Lady Harbury narrowed her eyes minimally, and felt, more than saw, how Étienne had become immobile in a way that suggested contained tension. "Of course," Clarisse replied softly, allowing Hawthorne to lead her toward the carriage where Mrs. Dawson was already waiting. Sabine followed behind, her gaze sending a silent message of solidarity to her cousin. But before getting into the carriage, Clarisse turned one last time. Her gaze swept the courtyard, the other farewells happening, servants moving efficiently, horses waiting patiently, and then, for only a fraction of a second, her eyes met Étienne's across the distance. He was standing beside Lucien, already near his own carriage, but at that moment, all his attention was focused on her. It was not obvious. No one who wasn't looking would have noticed, but Clarisse saw it. She saw the way he watched her like one memorizing something precious about to be lost. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had clenched into fists by his sides. And then, so subtly it could have been imagined, he inclined his head. Not a formal bow, just the slightest movement of acknowledgement, of farewell, of something more that neither of them dared to name. Clarisse looked away first because she had to look away, because Hawthorne was watching, and waiting longer would be dangerous. She got into the carriage, Sabine following her, and Mrs. Dawson closed the door behind them. As the carriage began to move, Clarisse looked out the window one last time. Lady Harbury's estate was already beginning to shrink in the distance, that magnificent house that for a few days had been a refuge, a space where she could breathe. And there, still, standing in the courtyard, a figure in black watching the carriages depart, was Étienne de Valois, Comte Montclair. She could not see his eyes from that distance, but she felt the weight of that gaze all the same. London received them 3 days later with its characteristic cacophony, the constant noise of hooves on cobblestones, street vendors shouting their wares, the peculiar smell of a city too big for its own infrastructure. It was the complete opposite of Kent's serenity, and Clarisse felt the change as something physical, as if the very air was denser here, harder to breathe. The Pembertons' London house was in Mayfair, respectable but not ostentatious, reflecting the family's social position. Old lineage, but limited resources. Hawthorne had departed for his own residence in Berkeley Square as soon as they arrived, but not before informing Clarisse that he would visit her the next day to discuss the final preparations for the wedding. Now, lying in her London bed, Clarisse looked at the ornate ceiling and tried not to think of green eyes that captivated her, of a gentle touch through gloves, of words spoken in a husky voice that made her heart ache. She tried, and failed miserably. Étienne and Lucien arrived in London the same day, settling into a rented residence in St. James, convenient for the gentlemen's clubs and respectable enough to avoid unnecessary gossip about Frenchmen in the city. "Well," Lucien declared, throwing himself into an armchair in the drawing-room with that lack of ceremony that only decades of friendship permits, "we survived rural English hospitality. Now comes the truly challenging part, navigating London society without creating an international incident." Étienne did not reply, standing by the window, watching the busy street below. His posture was rigid again, all that momentary softness Lucien had seen emerge in Kent, carefully tucked back away. "Étienne," Lucien said more, seriously setting aside his lightness. "Mon ami, you cannot just—" "Cannot what?" Étienne turned around and there was something dangerous in his expression. "I cannot do anything, Lucien. She is promised. In weeks she will be married, and I am merely a temporary visitor in a country that still views me with suspicion for having fought on the wrong side of a war. You fought for your country. There is no wrong side to that. Try explaining that to the English." He ran a hand through his hair, undoing the careful arrangement. "Besides, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. What I feel or do not feel is irrelevant in the face of signed contracts and social expectations." Lucien stood up, approaching his friend. "What if he is not who he appears to be? What if there are things about Lord Hawthorne that should be known before this marriage happens?" Étienne turned to face him completely. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Lucien said carefully, "that men who control their fiancés the way we observed, who squeeze delicate wrists too hard, who demand obedience as if they were feudal lords, such men rarely limit their questionable behavior to only one area of their lives. You want to investigate him. I want to know the truth. And you, mon ami, even if you won't admit it, want to too." Lucien crossed his arms. "Tomorrow night we will go to White's. Hawthorne is a member. We will be properly introduced. We will be discreet, we will observe, we will converse. And if there is nothing but a controlling temperament, then at least we will know. And if there is more," Lucien held his gaze firmly, "then we will decide what to do with that information." Étienne was silent for a long moment, internal war clear in his eyes. Finally he nodded. "Tomorrow then." White's Club was exactly what Étienne expected. All discreet opulence in dark mahogany and leather tones, smelling of expensive tobacco and aged cognac. Masculine conversations echoing in carefully moderated volumes. It was the kind of place where fortunes were made and unmade on bets, where reputations were built or destroyed in hallway conversations, where the English elite gathered to be exactly who they were, without the restraints of female presence. They were introduced to the club by Lord Ashworth, an old acquaintance of Lucien's from the times when he frequented London before the war. The older gentleman, with impressive grey whiskers, received them with reserved but genuine cordiality, made the necessary introductions to the members present, and, after ensuring they were appropriately settled, retired to his own occupations. "Discreet and efficient," Lucien murmured in approval as they watched Lord Ashworth walk away. "Exactly the kind of introduction we needed, visible enough to be respectable, discreet enough not to attract unnecessary attention." Hawthorne was in the card room, surrounded by other gentlemen, a respectable pile of chips in front of him. Étienne and Lucien positioned themselves at a nearby table with a view of the scene, ostensibly playing among themselves, but in reality observing. "He plays well," Lucien murmured in French, keeping his expression casual. "But see how he reacts when he loses. that stiffening in his shoulders, the way his fingers squeezed the cards. Étienne had already noticed. He had also noticed how Hawthorne drank faster than the others, how his bets progressively increased, how there was a feverish quality to his concentration. It was when a younger gentleman, he couldn't have been more than 22, made a particularly audacious bet, and one that Étienne saw the mask slip. For only a moment, Hawthorne looked at the young man with such hatred that Étienne felt something cold run down his spine. He knew that look. He had seen it on the faces of men about to do terrible things on battlefields. "Beginner's luck," Hawthorne said, and his voice was controlled, but there was venom there. "Although a gentleman should know when to stop before he's beyond his means." "My means are perfectly adequate, Lord Hawthorne," the young man replied, clearly missing the danger. "For now." Hawthorne smiled, but there was no warmth there. "But the game is unpredictable. And debts, well, debts have a way of accumulating when you least expect it." It was a veiled threat. Everyone at the table knew it, but it was subtle enough not to be directly confronted. The game continued, and Hawthorne lost again. This time Étienne saw how his fingers cramped around his glass, how something in the quality of his smile became fixed and artificial. "I need air," Hawthorne announced abruptly, getting up. "We will continue later." He left the table, and Étienne exchanged a look with Lucien. Without words, both also stood up, following at a discreet distance. Hawthorne went to a less frequented corridor, where private conversations could happen away from curious ears. Another gentleman was already waiting there, a middle-aged man with the appearance of someone who had lived far beyond his means for too long. "Hawthorne," the man began, and there was despair in his voice. "About what we discussed earlier. I need more time. The interest rates you are charging they are fair considering the risk." Hawthorne cut him off coldly. "You agreed to the terms." "Pemberton?" Étienne froze. Pemberton, Clarisse's surname. This was her father, he realized, and he was indebted to Hawthorne. "I agreed because I had no choice," Clarisse's father said, and there was a break in his voice. "And now you demand my daughter too." "I demand nothing. You offered her as additional collateral when you realized you could not pay. Do not turn your own lack of resources into villainy on my part." Hawthorne approached, and even in the dimly lit corridor, Étienne could see the cruelty in his expression. "But don't worry. I will take very good care of your daughter. I will teach her what obedience means, and you, in turn, will continue to pay what you owe, not just in money, but in political influence and social connections. After all, fathers-in-law should be useful, shouldn't they?" It was revolting. It was more than that. It was a revelation of a fundamentally corrupted soul, of someone who saw people as pieces in a game, as property to be acquired and exploited, a vile, unscrupulous man. Étienne felt something awaken within him, that part that the war had hardened, that knew how to assess threats and neutralize them. But he also felt something else, a cold, concentrated fury that had nothing to do with battles and everything to do with a sweet-eyed, red-haired young woman who played the piano as if breathing, who cried silently in twilight gardens, who deserved much more than to be currency in the machinations of a perverse and dishonorable man. He carefully backed away, pulling Lucien with him before they could be discovered. They returned to the main room, sat in secluded armchairs, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lucien broke the silence, his voice low and loaded with revulsion. "If this is the man who will marry the young woman, God have pity on her." Étienne looked at the glass of cognac in his hand, watching how the candlelight played through the amber liquid. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something in it that made Lucien straighten, an echo of the command voice he had used at Waterloo, when decisions had to be made and lives depended on his clarity. "I will not ask God for pity," he said, raising his eyes to meet his friend's. "I will take care of it myself." Lucien studied his face for a long moment. He knew his friend too well. "Étienne, what are you planning?" "I do not know yet. But this," he gestured vaguely toward where Hawthorne still was. "This cannot happen. I cannot allow it to happen." "Do you understand what you are saying? The risks involved?" "I understand perfectly." Étienne finished his cognac in one gulp. "I understand that if I do nothing, I will spend the rest of my life knowing I condemned someone to a fate I could have prevented. And I already carry enough absences, Lucien. I already carry enough deaths and failures. I will not add this one to the—" Collection. Lucien was silent. Then slowly a smile began to form on his lips. Not his usual smile of amusement, but something sharper, more determined. An insolent determination. "Well," he said finally, "if we are going to ruin an English lord and potentially create a social scandal, we will need a very good plan. We will need evidence," Étienne corrected. "Solid, irrefutable, not just what we overheard tonight. Then we will continue to investigate. Discreetly, carefully." Lucien leaned forward. "And in the meantime we need to find a way to protect her. If Hawthorne finds out we are investigating, he might speed up the wedding. He might become more violent." Étienne's jaw tightened. "I will not allow him to hurt her, mon ami," Lucien said gently. "I fear he is already hurting her. The question is how we stop it before the damage is permanent." They sat there as the club continued its routine around them. Gentlemen laughing, bets being placed, conversations about politics and horses, and all the topics that men of means discussed. And in the middle of it all, two French war veterans began to plot something that was simultaneously rescue and revenge, protection and rebellion. Because some injustices were too great to ignore, some people were too important to be sacrificed on the altar of social convenience. And Clarisse Pemberton, Étienne had decided with a clarity that frightened him in its intensity, was the most important of them all. Across London, Clarisse was awake too, staring into the darkness of her room, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on her like something physical. In a few weeks, she would be Lady Hawthorne. In a few weeks, her life as she knew it would end. And she did not even know that at that exact moment, someone was deciding to fight for her. Someone who should be a stranger, but who somehow in a few days had become something much more significant. Something she still did not have the courage to name. Lady Harbury's London residence was located in Grosvenor Square, a house of honey-coloured bricks with tall windows that captured the morning light in an almost magical way. It was smaller than her Kent estate, of course, but what it lacked in size it made up for in elegance. Its private garden, though compact by rural standards, was an oasis of green amidst the urban grey, all climbing roses, well-kept gravel paths, and a small ornamental pond where goldfish swam lazily. Clarisse had received the invitation 3 days after her arrival in London, delivered by a discreet messenger on a morning when Hawthorne was absent attending to business. Lady Harbury's elegant handwriting was unmistakable. "My dear, it would be an immense pleasure to welcome you and Lady Sabine for an informal breakfast, followed by a stroll through the gardens. Nothing elaborate, just a few dear friends enjoying each other's company away from the vigilant eyes of society. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, if you are able." Sabine, who was present when the invitation arrived, had looked up with sharp interest. "Lady Harbury does not issue casual invitations," she had observed. "Everything she does is carefully orchestrated, even when it seems spontaneous." "Do you think that—" Clarisse had begun but couldn't finish the question, because even thinking about it seemed dangerous, seemed to give form to hopes she should not nurture. "I think she sees what everyone should see but chooses to ignore," Sabine had replied, touching her cousin's arm gently. "And I think she is trying to give you a few moments of peace before—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Before the marriage imprisoned her forever. Now, as her carriage passed through the morning streets of London, Mrs. Dawson, sitting opposite them with the impeccable posture of one who had served respectable families her whole life, Clarisse felt her heart beat. Irregularly. She wore a soft green morning gown, again at Sabine's insistence, with a white muslin shawl over her shoulders. Her red hair was styled in a simple but elegant arrangement, a few curls framing her face purposefully. "Breathe," Sabine whispered beside her, squeezing her gloved hand. Just breathe. But breathing felt like a monumental task when every beat of her heart whispered a possibility she dared not name. Lady Harbury's house was already lively when they arrived. Discreet servant led them through the entrance hall, all marble and gilded mirrors, to a drawing room that opened onto the gardens. There were perhaps 10 people present, distributed in small groups conversing in melodious tones. Lady Catherine and her daughter were there, as were 2 other ladies Clarisse vaguely recognized from Kent. Mr. Fairfax was near a window, gesturing animatedly about something that probably involved poetry. And then she saw Lady Harbury, resplendent, in a sky-blue morning gown, moving among her guests with the grace of a born hostess. When her eyes met Clarisse's, something passed through them. Satisfaction, perhaps, or the conspiratorial joy of someone about to witness something they had carefully orchestrated. "Mes chers," she exclaimed, approaching to kiss both Clarisse's cheeks and then Sabine's. "What a joy to have you here. London can be so stifling this time of year, but I firmly believe that good friends and well-kept gardens can make any city bearable." "Lady Harbury, your house is magnificent," Clarisse said sincerely, looking around. "Oh, it's just a jewel box compared to the Kent estate, but it has its charms." She took Clarisse's arm, guiding her further into the room. "Come, there are people who will be delighted to see you again." Clarisse felt her heart pound. Her eyes found the masculine figure that had permeated her most secret thoughts for days. Étienne was near the French doors leading to the garden in conversation with Lucienne. Both wore impeccable morning attire, but it was Étienne who captured all her attention. His brown hair brushed back, the strong line of his jaw, the way he held a teacup as if he didn't quite know what to do with it. And then, as if feeling the weight of her gaze, he turned around. Their eyes met across the room, and Clarisse felt that now familiar sensation of recognition, as if something within her simultaneously awoke and calmed in his presence. She saw genuine surprise cross his face. He clearly hadn't expected to see her there, followed by something more complex, a mixture of joy and pain that she understood perfectly because she felt the same. Lucien noticed everything, of course. His blue eyes danced between them and a smile slowly curved his lips. He lightly touched Étienne's arm, saying something in a low voice that made his friend stiffen his shoulders before both crossed the room toward them. "Lady Clarisse." "Lady Sabine." Lucien made an elaborate bow, his eyes sparkling with contained amusement. "What a delightful surprise to find you here, and I thought this morning would be tediously predictable." "Monsieur Beaumont," Sabine replied with a smile. "Am I to assume your presence means trouble is about to ensue? Mademoiselle wounds me." He placed a hand over his heart dramatically. "I am the very image of decorum." "You are the very image of someone who knows exactly how much impropriety he can get away with," Sabine corrected, but there was affection in her tone. While they exchanged witty barbs, Étienne approached Clarisse, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. There was so much in that look, unasked questions, carefully contained emotions, an intensity that made her forget to breathe. "Lady Clarisse," he said, his voice husky in a way she was starting to recognize as characteristic when he was emotionally affected. "It is unexpected to see you here, and yet here I am," she replied softly, aware of how her hands trembled slightly beneath her gloves. "Yes," he said, and there was so much weight in that single word. "Here you are." Lady Harbury, observing everything with those experienced eyes that missed nothing, clapped her hands lightly to attract the group's attention. "Mes amis, breakfast is served in the winter garden. It is such a beautiful day that it would be a crime to stay indoors. Afterward, for those who wish, I suggest a walk through the gardens. There is a particularly lovely path around the pond that I guarantee will be worth the effort." The group moved toward the winter garden, a glass and wrought iron structure attached to the house, all filtered light and exotic plants. Small tables were arranged with casual elegance, allowing for intimate conversations while still maintaining the appearance of a proper social event. Clarisse found herself seated with Sabine, Mrs. Dawson, appropriately close but not intrusive, and through some magic of Lady Harbury's, Étienne and Lucien at the next table, close enough that conversations could flow between the groups, but not so close that it seemed improper. The breakfast was a succession of delicate dishes, eggs prepared in 3 different ways, thin toast with homemade jams, artfully arranged fresh fruits, tea served in porcelain so fine that light passed through it. But Clarisse barely touched the food, acutely. Aware of how Étienne was there, so close that if she reached out she could almost touch him. "Lady Clarisse," Lucien drew her attention, his eyes dancing with ill-contained mischief. "I hear the gardens of Grosvenor Square are particularly beautiful this time of year. Flowers of every kind blooming. It would be a shame not to explore them properly." "Indeed," Lady Harbury joined the conversation softly, "and the path around the small pond is wide enough for comfortable walks. Perhaps," she looked meaningfully at Mrs. Dawson, "our dear Mrs. Dawson could accompany Lady Sabine and me at a more leisurely pace, while the younger ones explore more extensively." It was masterful orchestration. Mrs. Dawson, who knew her role and clearly approved of the Countess's approach, nodded with dignity. Certainly, my lady. My joints thank you for the consideration. Sabine shot a look at Clarisse, part worry, part encouragement, then smiled at Lady Harbury. I am curious about your climbing roses. Mrs. Dawson, Lady Harbury mentioned she has a particularly rare variety from France. And so, with the subtlety of a master strategist, Lady Harbury created the opportunity that everyone knew she was creating, but which no one could accuse of impropriety. Moments later, Clarisse found herself walking along the gravel paths, Étienne a few appropriate steps away, Lucien just ahead, serving as a technically appropriate but conveniently distracted chaperone by something that demanded his attention. A particularly interesting bird. The garden was truly magnificent. Roses of every imaginable color climbed up trellises and walls, their fragrances mingling in the morning air. The ornamental pond shimmered under the sun, and the soft sound of moving water came from a small but elegant fountain. For some time, they simply walked in silence, that kind of silence that was not uncomfortable, but rather full of all the things they wanted to say, but did not know how to begin. It was Étienne who finally broke that stillness. "How have you been?" he asked, his voice low just for her. "Since returning to London?" Clarisse considered lying, considered saying she was well, that everything was perfectly adequate. But something in the way he had asked, with genuine interest rather than empty courtesy, made the truth escape. "Small," she said softly. "I feel like my life is getting smaller and smaller, as if the walls are slowly closing in." She heard him inhale sharply, saw out of the corner of her eye how his hands clenched into fists by his sides. "Clarisse," he began, then stopped, as if realizing he had used her given name without a title, without the formal distance he should maintain. But she did not correct him. She liked how her name sounded in his voice, weighted with that French accent that turned every syllable into music. They reached a part of the path where ancient trees created a canopy of shade, where the rest of the group could not see them clearly. Lucien, blessed Lucien, had stopped even further ahead, examining something with theatrically intense concentration. Étienne tried again, visibly struggling with words. "I have no right to ask, I have no right to care, but I cannot help it." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "When I saw you play the piano that afternoon, when the music flowed from your fingers as if it were part of your soul, it was the first time. In years I felt anything but emptiness." Clarisse turned to face him completely, allowing her mask to slip. There was something in the way he looked at her, not with pity but with understanding, that made her want to be honest. "Étienne," she said his name for the first time and saw the impact it had on him, how his eyes briefly closed. "Tell me about Waterloo. Tell me about your brothers." He opened his eyes, surprised. "Why?" "Because I need to remember that I am not the only person carrying weight." She took a step closer. "Because when you speak, I can breathe." Something broke in his expression. He looked around quickly. Lucien was still pretending to be absorbed. The rest of the group was out of sight. And then he began to speak. "I had 2 brothers," he said, his voice choked but controlled. "Philippe was the middle one, always laughing, always confident. And Alexandre," his voice wavered slightly. "He was only 19. I tried to convince him to stay, but he said brothers fight together." Clarisse held her breath, seeing raw pain cross his face. "Philippe died on the first day. Alexandre survived longer. 3 days. He was in my arms when—" He stopped, unable to continue. "Oh, Étienne," Clarisse whispered, and without thinking her hand reached for his. He looked down to where their gloved hands touched, and his fingers closed around hers with a need that was almost desperate. "I promised my mother I would bring them back," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "And I failed." "No." Clarisse squeezed his hand, moving closer. "It was not your fault." "Then why do I feel like I chose to live when they died?" His eyes met hers, and there was so much torment there that it broke her heart. "Because you are still here to feel," she replied gently. "Because pain means you loved, and love is never wasted." He looked at her, as if she had said something he needed to hear, but had never been able to articulate. And then slowly his free hand rose, hesitated, and with infinite care touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of a tear on her cheek. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "How do you make me feel that maybe I deserve to keep breathing?" "The same way you make me feel that maybe I am more than just a piece in a game," she replied, leaning minimally toward his touch. The air between them changed, became dense, charged. Clarisse was aware of every beat of her heart, of how their bodies were too close for propriety but not close enough. "You are promised to another," Étienne said, his voice husky. "But tell me." He hesitated, his eyes dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Tell me that this moment is mine. Just this moment in this garden, where we are not a Comte and a lady, but just Étienne and Clarisse," she completed, her heart pounding too hard. "We," he whispered, "just us." He leaned closer, so slowly that she had all the time in the world to retreat. But she did not retreat. Instead, she rose on her tiptoes minimally, closing that last fraction of distance. "Tell me that. This kiss is mine." His lips met hers, so lightly it could barely be called a kiss. It was just a soft touch, a promise and acknowledgement of something they both knew was impossible, but which existed nonetheless. There was no urgency or impropriety. It was just connection. Pure, painful, devastatingly beautiful. Clarisse felt tears slide down her cheeks again. She felt how he trembled slightly, how his fingers squeezed hers as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored. And then, as gently as it began, it ended. He retreated a few inches, but it could have been miles by the way the loss of that contact hit her. Their eyes met again, and in that gaze passed a shared recognition that a line had been crossed from which there was no return. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize," Clarisse interrupted. "Don't you dare apologize for making me feel just for a moment that I am not alone." He closed his eyes, pain crossing his features. "You are not alone. You never will be, as long as I breathe." Voices came from afar, the rest of the group approaching. They quickly moved apart, composing appropriate expressions, wiping away tears, building back the walls they had allowed to crumble for a precious moment. But when Lady Harbury and the others appeared, on the path, when they had to resume their roles as polite guests, something had irrevocably changed. Clarisse briefly touched her lips, still feeling the ghost of that touch, that stolen moment that was both the most innocent and most significant she had ever experienced in her life. And Étienne walked beside Lucien, answering questions with single syllables, while his friend watched him with a mixture of concern and understanding, knowing without needing to ask that something fundamental had just happened, something that could not be undone. Later, when the farewells were made, and Clarisse found herself back in the carriage with Sabine and Mrs. Dawson, her cousin held her hand and asked no questions. She just held her hand as Clarisse looked out the window, seeing London pass in a blur, her heart divided between the memory of a forbidden touch and the future that still awaited her. And somewhere in the city, Étienne de Valois, Comte Montclair, was standing. By the window of his rented residence, one hand pressed against his lips, remembering, knowing that that moment in the garden had changed everything, because now it was no longer about abstract honor. It was personal. It was visceral. It was about a red-haired young woman with lovely, innocent eyes, whose touched lips tasted of tears and impossible promises, and he would do anything, to save her. 5 days. 5 days since that stolen kiss in the garden, since that touch. That was both everything and nothing, since Clarisse had discovered it was possible to feel completely alive and completely lost at the same time. 5 days of exquisite torture. Hawthorne had visited her every day. Every morning, promptly at 10 o'clock, he would arrive to pay his respects and discuss the wedding preparations, a phrase he used as if it were about floral arrangements and guest lists, when in reality it was about control, about reminding her with every visit that her time was running out. 3 weeks. Just 3 weeks until she became Lady Hawthorne, until her life as she knew it definitively ended. And in each of those visits, she pretended. She smiled at the appropriate moments, nodded when expected, kept her hands quiet in her lap even when he held them too tightly. She pretended to be the perfect bride, demure, obedient, but at night, alone in her room, she allowed herself to remember amber-flecked green eyes that truly saw her, to remember a husky voice whispering her name as if it were precious, to remember lips warmly touching hers with a gentleness that had made her cry. And every morning she woke up knowing those memories were all she would have, that there was no future there, only a stolen moment that would have to last a lifetime until the invitation arrived. It was the 6th day when Lady Harbury's messenger appeared again, this time with a more elaborate invitation, written on cream paper with gilded edges. "My dear Clarisse, it would be an honor if you and Lady Sabine could join me this evening for an intimate soirée. Music, pleasant conversation, and perhaps an opportunity to breathe away from the pressures of the season, at 7 o'clock, if convenient." Sabine read the invitation over her shoulder and smiled. "Lady Harbury doesn't give up easily, does she?" "No," Clarisse replied, her heart beating irregularly. "She does not." Now, as her carriage passed through the London streets at twilight, Clarisse felt that familiar mix of anticipation and terror. He would be there. She knew it without needing to ask. Lady Harbury would not issue an invitation like that without reason, and her reason always involved creating carefully orchestrated opportunities. "Are you well?" Sabine asked softly, noticing how her cousin's fingers nervously intertwined. "I don't know," Clarisse admitted. "I don't know if it's possible to be well when every part of you is pulled in opposite directions." Sabine squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens tonight, I am here. I will always be here." Lady Harbury's house was more softly lit this evening, not the profusion of candles of a grand event, but something more intimate, more welcoming. Only a few carriages were parked outside. This would indeed be a small soirée then. A servant led them to the music room, and Clarisse felt her heart race as she crossed the threshold. The room was arranged differently. Today, chairs and sofas set in small groups that encouraged intimate conversations, amber-toned candles casting soft shadows, and near the windows overlooking the garden now plunged into darkness, a small ensemble of musicians tuning their instruments. There were perhaps 15 people present. Lady Catherine with her daughter, Mr. Fairfax, gesticulating animatedly to 2 other ladies, and there, near the fireplace where a fire softly crackled, Lucien conversing with Lady Harbury, his blue eyes dancing with amusement over something she had just said, and beside them, a glass of wine in his hands that he seemed to have completely forgotten, was Étienne. He leaned closer, so slowly that she had all the time in the world to retreat. But she did not retreat. Instead, she rose on her tiptoes minimally, closing that last fraction of distance. "Tell me that. This kiss is mine." His lips met hers, so lightly it could barely be called a kiss. It was just a soft touch, a promise, an acknowledgement of something they both knew was impossible, but which existed nonetheless. There was no urgency or impropriety. It was just connection, pure, painful, devastatingly beautiful. Clarisse felt tears slide down her cheeks again. She felt how he trembled slightly, how his fingers squeezed hers as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored. And then, as gently as it began, it ended. He retreated a few inches, but it could have been miles by the way the loss of that contact hit her. Their eyes met again, and in that gaze passed a shared recognition that a line had been crossed from which there was no return. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I shouldn't have—" "Ma chère Clarisse!" Lady Harbury's voice broke the moment, and Clarisse blinked, forcing herself to move to cross the room toward the hostess. "And Sabine, dear, what a joy to have you here. Come, come." Introductions were made, pleasantries exchanged, and somehow, always, somehow when Lady Harbury was involved, Clarisse found herself seated on a sofa near the window, Sabine by her side, but soon engaged in conversation with Lucien, who had strategically seated himself in front of them, and Étienne. Étienne was standing near the fireplace, seemingly absorbed in watching the flames, but she felt the weight of his attention even when he did not look directly. The music began, something gentle by Handel, all lyrical melody and gentle harmony. Conversations flowed, around occasional laughter punctuating the air, and Clarisse tried to focus, tried to participate, but she was hyper-aware of his every movement, of every time he shifted position, of how his hands clenched and unclenched by his sides as if fighting some impulse. It was when it began to rain that everything changed. Not a gentle spring rain, but a sudden storm, that kind of London rain that arrives without warning, all distant thunder and water beating against glass. The wind picked up, making the windows rattle, and Lady Harbury stood up with a theatrical sigh. "My goodness, what a storm! We must close the library windows before the rain ruins my books. Clarisse, dear, would you mind helping me? You are young and agile, and my joints are not what they used to be." It was transparent, completely, obviously transparent, but Clarisse found herself standing up anyway, following Lady Harbury out of the salon, so aware of how Étienne had also moved, how he was also following, a few steps behind. The library was at the end of a corridor, a magnificent room lined with books from floor to ceiling, with a rolling mahogany ladder that allowed access to the higher volumes. There were 3 large windows overlooking the garden, and 2 of them were open, curtains violently fluttering with the wind, rain already beginning to soak the Persian rug underneath. "Oh, worse than I thought," Lady Harbury murmured, moving quickly to the first window. Clarisse went to the second, struggling with the latch that seemed to be stuck, and when she finally managed to close it, she turned around and discovered she was alone. Lady Harbury had disappeared. The door was closed, and Étienne was there, standing near the third window which he had just closed, looking at her with an expression that was both tortured and hungry. "She left us alone," Clarisse said unnecessarily, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. "Yes," Étienne replied, without moving. "She is persistent in her generosity." The silence between them was dense, heavy with everything they could not say. The rain hammered against the now closed panes, creating a kind of cocoon around them, isolating them from the rest of the world. Light came only from 2 candles on the desk, casting dancing shadows across the book-lined walls. "We should go back," Clarisse said, but did not move. "Yes," Étienne agreed, but also remained where he was. His eyes traced her face, moving down the line of her neck, returning to her eyes. "We should," but neither of them moved. They stood there, separated by the width of the room, but connected by something so tangible that Clarisse could almost see it, an invisible thread pulling them toward each other. "Étienne," she began, not knowing what she was going to say. "No," he interrupted, his voice husky. "Please, do not torture me by saying my name like that. Not when we are dangerously alone. Not when every fiber of my being is fighting the impulse to—" He stopped, closing his eyes tightly, his hands clenching into fists. "I should leave, my lady. I should leave this room now. Before what?" Clarisse heard herself ask, taking a step toward him. She had not planned to do this, but her feet moved independently of her will. His eyes opened again, and there was something wild in them now. "Before I do something we will both regret. Before I completely forget that you are not mine to desire. And what if I don't care?" The daring words came out before she could stop them. "What if I am tired of doing the right thing? Of being the person everyone expects me to be all the time?" He took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance between them until they were just a few feet from each other. "You don't know what you are saying." "Yes, I do," she insisted, and there was a desperate courage in her voice now. "I know that in 3 weeks I will be the wife of a man who sees me as property. I know that I will spend the rest of my life being molded and diminished until there is nothing left of me that is recognizable. I know that this moment, now, may be the last time I feel something real before everything becomes pretense and obligation, a dreary life of constant unhappiness." Étienne made a sound that was almost a groan, his hands rising to run through his hair, undoing the careful styling. "Clarisse, you are destroying me." "Well," she said, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks, "you are destroying me too. From the moment I met you, from the moment you looked at me as if you truly saw me, you have been destroying me in the most beautiful and painful way possible." He closed the final distance between them then, not touching but so close that she could feel the heat of his body, could see how his breathing was altered, could see the struggle happening in his eyes. "You want to know what I think," she continued, her voice breaking. "I think that for the first time in my life I understand what it means to be alive. Not just existing, not just going through expected motions, but truly alive. And that terrifies me because I know I cannot keep it. I know this feeling is borrowed and will have to be given back, suffocated, but still I cannot regret it. I cannot regret having met you, having felt this, even if it breaks me into pieces afterward. Clarisse." His voice was only a tortured whisper. "Tell me," she pleaded, raising her eyes to his. "Tell me I am not the only one. Tell me you feel this too, that I am not inventing invisible bonds that do not exist." For a long moment, he just looked at her, and she saw when the decision was made, when he stopped fighting what he felt and simply allowed it to exist. "You are not inventing anything," he said finally. his voice heavy with raw emotion. "Since that first night, since I saw you in Kent, something in me that was dead began to awaken. And it terrifies me, Clarisse. It terrifies me how much I think of you, how much every moment away from you feels wasted, how much I desire things I have no right to desire." His hands rose then, hesitated, and then, as if he could no longer restrain himself, he touched her face with both hands, cupping it with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. "You are everything I thought I lost in the war," he whispered, his thumbs tracing her cheeks. "Hope, beauty, the possibility that there is still goodness in this world. And when I am near you, when you look at me like that, I can almost believe I deserve this, that I deserve to feel something other than guilt and emptiness." "You do deserve it," Clarisse said with fervor, her own hands rising to cover his where they touched her face. "You deserve to be happy. You deserve to be seen. You deserve—" "Do I deserve you?" he interrupted, and there was a painful bitterness in his voice now. "Because that is the problem, Clarisse. You are the one thing I desire and the one thing I cannot have. And knowing that, feeling that—" He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as if trying to control himself. "If it is a sin to desire you, then I am already terribly condemned." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, with confession, with all the impossibility of their situation. Clarisse felt new tears slide down her cheeks, and he wiped them with his thumbs, each touch so gentle that it made her want to cry more. "Étienne," she whispered, "it is not a sin. It cannot be a sin when it feels like the only true thing I have ever felt in a world full of lies." He opened his eyes, and what she saw there left her breathless. It was not just desire, although there was that too. It was more. It was devotion. It was torment. It was a man on the edge of a precipice fighting the impulse to jump. For an impossible moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. She saw his eyes drop to her lips, saw how he leaned in minimally, saw how his entire body tensed with the effort of restraint. She rose on her tiptoes, closing part of the distance, and felt his breath mingle with hers, felt how easy it would be, so dangerously easy, to close that last inch. But instead of retreating, he moved closer, eliminating the space between them until their bodies almost touched. His hands slid from her face to her waist, holding her with a reverent gentleness, and then he inclined his head, his face so close that she could count every eyelash, see every variation of color in his green eyes. "Clarisse," he whispered, and her name sounded like both a prayer and a curse. Their lips brushed again, light as a sigh, a promise more than a kiss. Then he moved, his nose buried in her hair, inhaling the delicate scent. "I will not stand by," he murmured against her neck, so low she could barely hear it. "Watching you be delivered like a lamb to the wolf." Clarisse pulled back slightly, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" Something crossed his face. Determination, perhaps, or the shadow of a plan taking shape. For the first time since she had known him, she saw the beginning of a smile touch his lips. Not complete, just the promise of one. He leaned in again, placing a soft touch on the corner of her mouth, a kiss that was both chaste and devastatingly intimate. "We need to go back," he said, his voice regaining some composure, although his eyes still burned with intensity. "Before your absence is noted and places you in a delicate position." Clarisse looked at him intensely, trying to decipher what she saw on his face, what those words meant, what plan was forming behind those eyes. But he was already retreating, recomposing his expression into something appropriate for polite society, though his fingers lingered in releasing her waist, as if reluctant to lose her. Even for a few moments, she nodded, unable to find words, and turned toward the door. Her thoughts were spinning, her heart was pounding too hard, and she had the disturbing and wonderful certainty that something had changed, that he was not simply accepting the inevitable. But what did he plan to do, and would it be enough to change a destiny that seemed already written? They returned to the music room, separated by an appropriate distance, finding the group still animated by the music and conversations. Lady Harbury cast an assessing glance at them, saw something on their faces that made her sigh subtly but said nothing. She merely moved to engage Clarisse in conversation with Lady Catherine, effectively keeping her occupied for the rest of the evening. And Étienne returned to his post near the fireplace, accepting a new glass of wine from Lucien, who watched him with a questioning expression. But when their eyes met, Lucien saw something there that was not present before: purpose, determination, the transformation of a man who had decided to stop being a spectator of his own life. "Mon ami," Lucien said softly, "what are you planning?" "Justice," Étienne replied simply, his eyes meeting Clarisse's across the room for a brief moment before looking away. "And perhaps, if we are lucky, something that looks like redemption." Later, when Clarisse was back in her carriage, Sabine asked no questions about the time she had spent absent. She just held her hand as the rain continued to fall outside, washing the streets of London, but unable to wash away the confusion of emotions Clarisse carried, hope mixed with fear, desire intertwined with uncertainty. And in his rented residence, Étienne was not alone in his torment this time. Lucien was seated in an armchair, watching his friend with that keen attention that missed few details. "So," Lucien said finally, "shall we discuss what you are actually planning? Or shall we continue pretending that determined look I saw on your face means nothing?" Étienne turned from the window, and there was something different in his expression now. Not the melancholic resignation Lucien had grown accustomed to seeing, but something sharper, more focused. "How long do you think we need?" "For what?" Lucien leaned forward, interest piqued. "To gather enough evidence that cannot be ignored or explained, to expose a man who hides rottenness under a veneer of respectability." Étienne crossed his arms. "Is 3 weeks long enough?" "A week would be more than enough," Lucien replied, with that characteristic confidence. "For men who survived Waterloo, a week is an eternity." Their eyes met, that kind of look that only exists between men who have fought side by side, who carry shared scars, who need no words to understand what is being proposed. Complicity, loyalty, the silent determination not to stand by while an injustice unfolded before them. "Then let us go," Étienne said simply, picking up his coat. Lucien smiled, that sharp smile that appeared when he was about to do something dangerous. "Now? Tonight?" "Tonight," Étienne confirmed, and there was a cold determination in his voice now, an echo of the officer who had commanded men in battle. "The time for merely observing is over." A slow, wicked grin spread across Lucien's face, and then they went out into the rainy London night, two dark figures disappearing into the shadows of the wet streets, and anyone who saw them would have recognized the posture, the purpose. They were no longer just French visitors navigating London society. They were hunters, and the hunt had begun. The London night swallowed Étienne and Lucien like old accomplices, the rain gradually ceasing as they crossed streets that glistened under the light of the gas lamps. There was no hesitation in their steps, no discussion about where they were going. Men who survived. Waterloo developed a particular kind of efficiency. They knew when it was time to plan and when it was time to act. "We start with Jameson," Lucien said as they walked, his voice low but clear. "He works in the law offices in Lincoln's Inn. He owes me favors from that matter in Dover." Étienne nodded. Jameson was a clerk with access to records that most people didn't even know existed. Contracts, deeds, debt documents registered in the courts. It wasn't exactly legal to share such information, but Lucien had a peculiar ability to convince people that certain transgressions were justifiable. "And after that?" Étienne asked. "Then we visit Mrs. Crawford." Lucien smiled faintly in the darkness. "She runs that discreet house in Bloomsbury. She always knows who keeps mistresses, who frequents clandestine gambling dens, who has debts they'd prefer to keep hidden. Information is currency for her, and I have considerable credit." They walked in silence for a few moments, only the sound of their footsteps echoing on the wet stones. Then Étienne said, "Thank you." Lucien turned to look at him, surprised. "For what?" "For not questioning. For simply being here." "Mon ami," Lucien replied with unusual seriousness. "You spent years carrying guilt for deaths you could not prevent. If I can help you prevent one now, while there is still time—" He shrugged. "Besides, I have always detested men like Hawthorne, all that false respectability hiding. Rottenness. It will be a delightful pleasure to expose him." The first stop was a narrow, dark house near Lincoln's Inn. Lucien knocked in a specific pattern, 3 quick, pause, 2 slow, and moments later, the door opened a fraction, revealing a thin, middle-aged man with spectacles resting on the tip of his nose. "Monsieur Beaumont," Jameson said with a thick Cockney accent, "I should have guessed. Only you would appear at midnight demanding favors." "Not demanding, my dear." "Jameson, requesting." Lucien smiled his most charming smile. "And paying generously, as always." 20 minutes later, they left with a folder of carefully registered documents. Hawthorne had substantial debts, more than any casual observer would suspect. Loans from moneylenders, markers from illegal gambling houses, even mortgages on properties he claimed to own free and clear, all carefully hidden through intermediaries and trusts, but traceable to anyone who knew where to look. Enough to ruin him socially? Étienne asked as they flipped through the papers under the faint light of a street lamp. Enough to make him persona non grata in any respectable circle, Lucien confirmed. But we need more. Debts are scandal, but not crime. We need something more visceral. Mrs. Crawford received them in an elegantly furnished drawing room that smelled of expensive perfume and secrets. She was a woman in her early 50s, still beautiful in her own way, with eyes that missed nothing. "Lucien, dear," she purred, gesturing for them to sit. "And you brought a friend. How delightful. Mrs. Crawford, this is the Comte de Montclair. Étienne, this is the woman who knows all of London's dirty secrets." Flattering as always. She poured cognac for everyone in crystal glasses. "Now what do you need to know about noble gentlemen, and what is it worth to you?" Lucien placed a heavy purse on the table. "Lord Adrian Hawthorne, everything you know." Her eyes sparkled. "Ah, him!" She took a sip of her cognac, savouring both the drink and the moment. "Well, gentlemen, you are in luck. Hawthorne is a client of one of my establishments, although he does not know I know it. He uses false names, of course, but I recognize a face. And," Étienne leaned forward, tension visible in his shoulders, "and he has particular tastes. He likes young girls, very young girls, although I assure you all my girls are of legal age. But it is the behavior that is worrying. Violent, controlling. We had to ban him after an incident where he left one of the girls with bruises that took weeks to disappear." She paused. "And there are rumors that he keeps a mistress in Whitechapel. Very young, very frightened. Some people say he found her working as a maid and acquired her." Étienne felt cold anger stiffen in his chest. "Address? I can get it by tomorrow." She studied him with interest. "This is personal for you, isn't it?" "Comte?" "Very," he replied simply. She nodded, understanding passing through her eyes. "Then I also suggest you speak with Timothy Brooks. He runs one of the gambling houses where Hawthorne accumulates his debts. Brooks has particular methods of collecting, and Hawthorne owes him a small fortune. He would be happy to share details if he knew it could result in payment." They left with more names, more addresses, more threads to pull. The night stretched before them, and they used it completely, visiting contacts, collecting testimonies, gathering evidence. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, they had enough to destroy Hawthorne 10 times over. "I believe one night was incredibly more promising than a week, eh?" "Now," Lucien said as they finally returned to their residence, "we just need timing and presentation. Scandal is as much about how the information is revealed as it is about the information itself." Étienne held the folder of documents as if it were a weapon, because it was. "Lady Harbury," he said. "She will know how to orchestrate it." "I've always liked that fascinating woman," Lucien smiled. The following days were a careful dance. Étienne and Lucien met with Lady Harbury in secret, presenting their findings. The Countess listened to everything with an increasingly somber expression, her anger mounting with each revelation. "This man is monstrous," she declared finally, "and he is about to ruin a young woman who does not deserve such a fate." Her eyes hardened. "We will do this publicly. At the Ashworth's ball 5 days from now, everyone who matters will be there, including Lord Pemberton and the detestable Hawthorne. It will be impossible to hide or deny when confronted before society. But first, there was the event at Vauxhall Gardens, those nocturnal pleasure gardens where London society came to stroll under coloured lanterns, listen to music, and be seen. Lady Clarisse was there with Sabine, and Mrs. Dawson, and inevitably with Hawthorne. Étienne and Lucien arrived separately, maintaining appropriate distance but always keeping Clarisse in their sight. The gardens were magical at night, all golden light and dancing shadows, music floating through trees decorated with paper lanterns, paths winding between fountains and sculptures. Clarisse wore an ivory evening gown that made her red hair glow like fire under the lanterns, but Étienne immediately noticed how stiff she was, how her shoulders tensed whenever Hawthorne approached, how she kept her eyes down, avoiding her fiancé's gaze. "He is worse than usual," Lucien murmured next to Étienne. "Look how he holds her, as if entitled." It was true. Hawthorne's hand was firmly around Clarisse's elbow, guiding her through the gardens with a possessiveness that made Étienne want to cross the space between them and tear her away. But he forced himself to stay where he was, watching, waiting. It was when they moved away from the main group, following a more secluded path toward a less illuminated area of the gardens, that Étienne saw his opportunity. He gestured to Lucien. "Stay here, keep them occupied," and followed at a discreet distance. Hawthorne had stopped in a shaded area between two large oak trees, where the music was just a distant echo, and few people passed. He turned Clarisse to face him, and even from a distance, Étienne could see the tension in her body. "You have been distant," Hawthorne said, his voice low but weighted with veiled threat. "Since we returned from Kent, each day more withdrawn, more absent." "Forgive me," Clarisse replied, her voice trembling. "I have just been—" "I expected the opposite," he interrupted, his fingers tightening on her arm. "With the wedding approaching, I expected to see you more attentive, more receptive. After all, we will soon share intimacies that a wife must not only accept, but welcome with contentment." His words were polite, appropriate for a lady, but there was something beneath them, a possessiveness, a veiled promise, that made Clarisse shiver. "Or are you having inappropriate doubts?" "No, I merely—" Clarisse tried to pull back, but he held tighter. "Merely what?" He leaned closer, and there was something cruel in his smile now. "I thought I made it clear that obedience is expected, that your attention, your loyalty, your thoughts, all of it belongs to me now." "Lord Hawthorne, please, you are hurting me." "Am I?" His fingers squeezed even harder, making her stifle a whimper. "How sensitive. You will have to develop more resilience, my dear. When we are married, when you are legally under my control, you will learn that I have very specific expectations, and I do not tolerate deviations. I do not tolerate glances directed at other men. I do not tolerate anything that is not complete submission. Let go of me, please," Clarisse whispered, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "Or what?" Hawthorne laughed, a humorless sound. "Will you run? Where to, exactly? Your father has already spent my money. The contracts are signed. Do not deceive yourself, my lady. In a few days, you will belong to me whether you like it or not." It was then that Étienne stepped out of the shadows, his presence so sudden and so controlledly menacing that Hawthorne immediately released Clarisse, recoiling a step. "Ladies," Étienne said, his voice calm but loaded with something cold and dangerous, "do not belong to anyone, Lord Hawthorne." For a moment, the three of them froze, Hawthorne with shock that quickly turned to fury, Clarisse with tears in her eyes and visible relief on her face, and Étienne standing there like a wall of controlled containment, every muscle tense, but his posture perfectly polite. "This is none of your business, meddling Frenchman," Hawthorne spat the word as an insult. "This is my fiancée, and what we discussed could be heard by anyone passing on this path," Étienne interrupted smoothly, "including myself, who was merely strolling through the gardens and heard what sounded like muffled cries." His eyes, when they met Hawthorne's, were hard as stone. "Naturally, I came to investigate. I would be negligent in my position as a gentleman if I did not." Hawthorne stepped forward, trying to use his slightly superior height to intimidate. "You have been very present lately, very attentive to things that do not concern you." "I am attentive to any situation where a lady appears to be in distress," Étienne replied, not backing down an inch. "It is a matter of honor, but perhaps that is a concept you are unfamiliar with." The implication hung in the air between them, clear and insulting. Hawthorne stiffened, his hands clenching into fists, and for a moment, Clarisse thought he would actually attack Étienne right there, but Étienne merely looked at him, and there was something in his eyes, something that spoke of battles seen, of men faced, of a capacity for violence carefully controlled, but definitely present. It was the look of a soldier, of someone who knew real combat, and Hawthorne, for all his cowardly brutality against helpless women, immediately recognized that he was outmatched. "This is not over," Hawthorne said finally, his voice low and venomous. He turned to Clarisse. "We will return to the group. Now. And you," he looked at Étienne with ill-disguised hatred, "had better keep your distance from what is mine if you know what is good for you." Veiled threats, Étienne replied with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "are tools of men without real power, and I, Lord Hawthorne, am not easily impressed." They stared at each other for one more long moment, two men on opposite sides of an undeclared war, both knowing the real confrontation was yet to come. Then Hawthorne turned, abruptly taking Clarisse's arm again, though with less force this time, and led her back toward the more illuminated areas. But before they completely disappeared, Clarisse turned one last time, her eyes meeting Étienne's. In that look passed gratitude, fear, and something more. A silent question about what would happen now, about whether he really had a plan or if that had just been another stolen moment before the inevitable. Étienne held her gaze, and then, so subtly, that only she would see, he nodded. A silent promise, "I will not abandon you. I will not let you face this alone." Then she disappeared among the trees, and Étienne was left alone in the shadow, his hands trembling slightly with contained rage. Lucien approached slowly, having clearly witnessed at least part of the scene. "Well," Lucien said, "I think we can add public threats to our list of charges." "He will pay," Étienne said, and there was a dark promise in his voice. For her every tear, for every fear he planted, for every moment of pain he caused, he will pay for everything. "Yes," Lucien agreed, "he will. And there are only 5 days until the Ashworth's ball. 5 days until we expose everything he is before everyone who matters." They left the gardens in silence, two hunters already savoring the victory that was to come, while somewhere ahead, Clarisse was led back to her carriage by a man who did not know his time was running out, that the walls were closing in. Around him, that two determined Frenchmen had decided he was prey and the season had just opened. The war had been declared, and this time Étienne de Valois had no intention of losing. The morning after the incident at Vauxhall Gardens dawned grey and heavy, as if the sky itself were burdened with omens. Clarisse had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Hawthorne's face leaning over her, heard his words about intimacies and obedience, felt the persistent ache in her arm where he had held her too tightly. But she also saw another face, warm green eyes emerging from the shadows like a guardian, a calm but dangerous voice declaring that ladies belong to no one, and that silent nod, that mute promise that still made her heart race when she remembered it. It was Sabine who suggested they visit Lady Harbury that afternoon. "You need to get out of this house," her cousin had said gently, noticing the dark circles under Clarisse's eyes, the way she flinched at every sound of footsteps in the hallway, fearing it was Hawthorne coming for another of his visits. "And Lady Harbury has always been good at making us breathe." The Countess received them in her private drawing room, that smaller, more intimate room where she received only the people she genuinely liked. Tea was served in delicate porcelain, and for a few minutes they conversed about trivialities. The weather, a minor scandal involving Lady Catherine, the preparations for the Ashworth's ball. But Lady Harbury had eyes too sharp not to notice. "Clarisse, dear," she said finally, setting down her cup with a delicate click, "may I be direct with you?" Clarisse nodded, unable to find her voice. "There are things I have discovered about Lord Hawthorne, things that, as someone who cares deeply about your well-being, I feel I must share." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He has a history of violent behavior towards those under his power." The air rushed out of Clarisse's lungs all at once. Sabine reached for her hand, squeezing it firmly. "There is a young woman," Lady Harbury continued, her voice gentle but relentless, "who worked as a maid in a household he frequented. She was 16 when he noticed her. He acquired her, for lack of a better word. He keeps her now in Whitechapel, away from prying eyes." The Countess paused, allowing that to settle. "Recently she sought medical help. Extensive bruising, possibly. Broken ribs. The doctor who attended her is a man of conscience and shared his concerns with the right people, and this somehow reached my ears." Clarisse felt bile rise in her throat. Her hands began to tremble so violently that she had to set down her cup before she dropped it. "There is more," Lady Harbury said, and there was genuine sadness in her eyes now. "Substantial debts stemming from recent wagers in illegal gambling houses, connections with dangerous people, and a consistent pattern of controlling and brutalizing those who cannot defend themselves." She leaned forward, taking Clarisse's free hand. "Do you understand what I am telling you? The man you are about to marry is not who he appears to be. He is a predator, disguised as a gentleman." "I knew," Clarisse whispered, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "Part of me always knew. The way he holds me, the things he says, but to hear it like this, to know he truly—" She couldn't finish. Sobs cutting off her words. Sabine pulled her into a tight embrace, but it was Lady Harbury who said what needed to be said. "You do not have to marry him, dear." "But my father," Clarisse began. "Solutions are being worked on," Lady Harbury interrupted firmly. "There are people who care about you who are working even now to ensure you have a choice. But I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. If this marriage takes place, if you become legally his property—" She did not need to finish. All three women knew exactly what that would mean. Clarisse stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need air. Please excuse me." She practically ran for the door, crossing the hall toward the gardens, tears blinding her vision, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. The garden was empty at that time of day, the heavy clouds keeping most people indoors. Clarisse followed the paths without thinking, her feet automatically taking her to the most secluded part, where ancient trees created a green cathedral and a small stone bench was hidden among wild roses. She collapsed there, burying her face in her hands, and finally allowed everything to come out. All the fear, all the pain, all the feeling of being trapped in a cage that grew smaller every day. She wept for the maid Hawthorne had hurt, for the life she was about to lose, for the impossibility of everything. She did not hear footsteps approaching. She did not realize she was no longer alone until a husky, familiar voice said her name. "Lady Clarisse." She snapped her head up, frantically wiping away tears, and there he was, Étienne de Valois, standing a few steps away, and there was something in his expression. Concern, yes, but also a fierce determination she had not seen before. "How did you—" she began. "Lady Harbury sent for me," he said simply, approaching slowly, as if afraid of startling her. "She thought you might need— she thought I should be here." Fresh tears slid down her cheeks. "You know, about everything." Yes. He was before her now, so close she could see the lines of tension around his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched by his sides, as if fighting the impulse to touch her. "I know about the debts, about the violence, about everything he hides beneath that facade of respectability." "Then you understand," she said, her voice breaking, "that there is a way out, that no matter how monstrous he is, no matter how much I—" She stopped, conscious that she was about to confess something dangerous. "How much you what?" Étienne asked softly, kneeling before her so their eyes were level. "How much I wish to be anywhere but next to him," she finished, but they both knew that was not what she had almost said. Étienne remained silent for a long moment, just looking at her with that intensity that made her forget to breathe. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and framed her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears with a gentleness that made her want to cry more. "Clarisse," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her tremble. "You do not have to marry him. But my father will be taken care of. The debts will be paid. I am working on it, along with Lucienne and Lady Harbury. But I need you to understand something." He leaned closer, his green eyes capturing hers and not letting go. "I am not doing this just for abstract justice. I am not doing this just because Hawthorne is a vile man who deserves to be exposed. I am doing this because—" He hesitated, as if the next words were being ripped from somewhere deep inside him. "Because the thought of you in his hands, of you suffering what that poor maid suffered, destroys me in ways I cannot explain nor allow." "Étienne," she whispered, her heart accelerating. "No," he interrupted gently. "Let me finish, mon cher. Because I need to. Say this even if it is madness, even if it is improper." He took a deep breath. "I have not asked for your hand, Clarisse. I have no right to it. I have nothing to offer but a French title in a country still recovering from war. But I have asked for your heart. I have already asked without words every time I looked at you, every time I tried and failed to maintain appropriate distance. And if you tell me now that there is no hope, that you do not feel what I feel, then I will step away. I will find another way to save you that does not involve my own selfish desires." Clarisse looked at him through her tears, saw the raw vulnerability in his expression, the way he trembled minimally as if expecting rejection, and something inside her that had been contained for so long, by all the rules and expectations and fears, simply broke. "You have it," she whispered. "My heart. You already have it." The impact of those words washed across his face like a wave. For a moment he just remained motionless, as if he could not believe what he had heard. Then something in his expression changed, all that careful containment crumbling, and he pulled her to him. The kiss was not gentle like the previous ones. It was intense from emotion, not urgency. It was the meeting of two hearts that for too long had suffered in silence. It was years of loneliness finding connection. It was fear turning into hope. It was two broken human beings discovering that together they could be whole. His lips met hers with a passion she had never before experienced, and Clarisse heard herself make a sound, half sob, half gasp, as her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer. His hands slid from her face to his hair, undoing the careful styling, and she tasted the salty flavor of her own tears mixed with something else. Something that was purely him, purely this impossible moment. He angled his head, deepening the kiss, and there was a devotion in it that made her tremble with emotion. When they finally separated just enough to breathe, they remained like that, foreheads touching, breaths mingling, hands intertwined, as if the simple act of being connected was the only thing keeping them anchored. "Clarisse," he whispered against her lips, and her name had never sounded so precious. "Je t'aime. God help me. I love you in ways I no longer knew I was capable of feeling, mon amour." "Me too," she replied, tears still, sliding but different now. Not tears of despair, but of something that looked dangerously like hope. "I love you. I do not know when it began. I do not know how to stop. But I love you." He kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. Then he kissed her cheeks where tears still glistened, her forehead, her closed eyelids. Each kiss was a promise. Each touch was a silent vow. "I will not let you marry him," Étienne said finally, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. "I swear by all that is sacred, by my brothers I lost, by everything I still hold holy, I will not let you fall into his hands." "But how?" she began. "Leave that to me," he interrupted, touching her lips gently with his thumb. "Lady Harbury, Lucian, and I have a plan. At the Ashworth's ball in 4 days, everything Hawthorne hides will be exposed. Before society, before your father, before everyone. He will be ruined, and you will be free. And what if it doesn't work?" She whispered, fear still present in her eyes. "What if he—" "Then we will run away," Étienne said simply, and there was absolute determination in his voice. "To France, to Scotland, wherever necessary. But I will not allow you to become his victim. I would rather face any scandal, any consequence, than see you destroyed." Clarisse looked at him, at this man who weeks ago was a stranger and who now was everything. Her hope, her heart, her only light in a darkness that threatened to swallow her. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe there was a path that did not end in destruction. 4 days, she said. 4 days, mon cher, he agreed, and then everything changes. He kissed her once more, long and deep and full of promises they both prayed they could keep, and when they finally separated, when they had to compose appropriate expressions and return to the world that could not know what had just happened between them, something important had changed. They were no longer victims of circumstance. They were conspirators united against a common enemy, two hearts beating as one against the injustice that threatened to separate them. Later, when Clarisse returned to the drawing room where Sabine and Lady Harbury waited, her cousin immediately saw the difference. Her eyes were still red from tears, yes, but there was something else there now. A determination, a spark that had been absent for weeks. "Are you all right?" Sabine asked softly. "I will be," Clarisse replied, and for the first time in a long time she believed it. "In 4 days, I will be." Lady Harbury smiled, that smile that suggested she knew much more than she said. "Yes, dear. In 4 days, everything will change, and this time, it will be for the better." And somewhere in the gardens, Étienne was still standing where Clarisse had left him, a hand pressed against his lips, his heart pounding with a mixture of euphoria and terror, because now it was no longer about abstract honor or distant justice. It was about love, true, devastating, impossible, and absolutely irrevocable love. and he would fight with every ounce of strength he possessed to protect it. 4 days. Only 4 days until destiny was decided, until truths were revealed, until everything changed in ways neither of them could fully predict. But for now, for this stolen moment, they had each other. And sometimes, in the midst of darkness, that was enough to keep breathing. The night of the Ashworth's ball arrived with that quality of inevitability that certain events carry, as if destiny itself were holding its breath, waiting. The sky was clear, filled with stars that shone over London with a cruel indifference. The world would keep spinning regardless of what happened within those limestone walls. Clarisse wore navy blue tonight, a choice by Sabine that highlighted the paleness of her skin and made her eyes look even more luminous. But there were dark circles under those eyes, silent witnesses to sleepless nights, to hours spent staring at the ceiling while her heart oscillated between hope and terror. "Are you ready?" Sabine asked softly, adjusting Clarisse's shawl over her shoulders. "I don't know if anyone can be ready for something like this," Clarisse replied, her voice low, "but I suppose it doesn't matter. It has to happen." The Ashworth residence was resplendent when their carriage arrived, all lit up by 1,000 candles that made the windows gleam like jewels against the darkness. Music flowed through the open doors, and elegant carriages discharged their occupants in a constant stream of silk, jewels, and social expectation. Lord Pemberton accompanied his daughter and niece tonight, a man diminished by guilt and circumstance, his eyes shifting whenever they met Clarisse's. He knew what was about to happen. Lady Harbury had ensured it, and he also knew that his role would be crucial, that he would have to choose publicly between his debt to Hawthorne and his daughter. Clarisse prayed silently that he would choose correctly. The ballroom was magnificent, all gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers that cast prismatic light over the assembled guests. There must have been 200 people present, all the London aristocracy that mattered, all dressed in their finest clothes, all hungry for entertainment, and, though they did not yet know it, about to witness a scandal that would be talked about for years. Hawthorne found them immediately, as he always did, crossing the hall with that perfectly erect posture he cultivated. He wore black and white tonight, all controlled elegance, and when he smiled at Clarisse, any observer would say he was a loving fiancé greeting his future wife. But Clarisse saw what lay beneath that smile. She saw the possessiveness, the veiled threat, the absolute certainty that she belonged to him. "Lady Clarisse," he said, taking her hand and kissing it in an appropriate manner, but his fingers squeezed too tightly, a painful reminder that he still held power over her. "You look stunning tonight, as befits my future wife." "Lord Hawthorne," she responded, forcing her voice to remain steady. Across the room, Étienne watched. He stood near one of the tall windows, Lucienne at his side, and both wore almost complete black, as if they were in mourning or going into battle. Perhaps both, Clarisse thought. When Étienne's eyes met hers across the crowd, he nodded minimally. "It is time." Lady Harbury moved through the hall with the grace of a general positioning troops. Clarisse saw her pause briefly beside Lord Ashworth, saw how he nodded gravely at something she said, saw how he then moved to the center of the room, where a small platform was prepared for announcements. "My dear friends," Lord Ashworth began, his voice projecting easily across the hall, silencing conversations. "What a joy to have you all here tonight. But before the dancing begins, there is a matter of considerable importance that must be addressed. A matter concerning the honor, the truth, and the character of those we admit into our society." A murmur ran through the crowd. Clarisse felt Hawthorne stiffen beside her, his fingers still holding her hand in a grip that was beginning to hurt. "Monsieur Lucien Beaumont," Lord Ashworth continued, gesturing, "if you would join us?" Lucien moved through the crowd with that natural ease, ascending the platform carrying a leather folder. His blue eyes swept the room, and when he spoke, his voice carried both his usual charm and something harder beneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting this charming evening with unpleasant matters, but there are truths that can no longer remain hidden." He opened the folder, pulling out documents. "Lord Adrian Hawthorne, present here, has presented a facade of respectability that hides a much darker reality. This is outrageous." Hawthorne released Clarisse's hand, taking a step forward. "How dare a Frenchman—" "A Frenchman with evidence," Lucien interrupted smoothly. Evidence of substantial debts to moneylenders and illegal gambling houses, amounts totaling over £20,000. He held up documents. All carefully documented, all loans verified. Gasps ran through the crowd. £20,000 was a fortune, an amount that would ruin most noblemen. Lies, Hawthorne shouted, but there was panic in his eyes now. Fabrications from a foreigner who has questionable motives. Then perhaps you would prefer to hear direct testimony. Another voice cut through the hall, and Clarisse turned to see Étienne emerge from the crowd. He did not ascend the platform, remaining at floor level, but his presence commanded attention nonetheless. There is a young woman, Annie Fletcher, 16 years old, formerly a maid in Hawthorne's employ. She is here tonight under protection, and is prepared to testify about what he did to her. This is preposterous. Hawthorne was red now, his careful composure cracking. The word of a maid against that of a lord, you cannot... But the young woman was already being led forward by Lady Harbury. She was small, frail, with brown hair pulled back simply. Her face was pale, but there was determination in her eyes. As she faced the crowd, "My lord," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "he kept me against my will. He hurt me when I tried to leave. There are still marks." She began to pull up her sleeve. "No," Lady Harbury intervened gently. "You do not have to show. Your word is enough, and we have the testimony of the doctor who treated her." The crowd was in an uproar now, voices rising in shock and indignation. The idea of a gentleman not merely keeping a mistress, that was common. Enough, but her being a minor, keeping her against her will, physically harming her, was beyond acceptable. "There is more," Étienne said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Evidence of bribery, of illegal land dealings, of threats made to creditors. Lord Hawthorne is not who he claims to be. He is a man morally and financially ruined, hiding his true nature behind a mask of respectability." Lord Pemberton stepped forward then, and Clarisse saw how his hands trembled, how he seemed to have aged years in minutes. The engagement," he said, his voice breaking, "is broken off. My daughter will not marry a man of such. You can't," Hawthorne roared, all control abandoned now. He turned on Pemberton with savage fury. "You have a debt to me, old man. £5,000 you have already spent, and the terms were clear. Your daughter or full payment with interest you cannot afford." The hall fell into shocked silence. To say such things in public, to reveal financial arrangements in this manner, it was the worst kind of social violation, a true scandal. "Clarisse will be my wife," Hawthorne continued, moving toward her with furious strides. "Contracts were signed, agreements were made, and I will have what is due to me." He grabbed Clarisse's arm violently, dragging her toward the exit. She cried out in pain and surprise, trying to pull free, but he was too strong, his rage giving him even more strength. "You are coming with me now," he hissed, pulling her along. "You will give me what I want, or you will learn what happens to disobedient fiancés. She is not going anywhere with you." Étienne's voice sliced through the chaos like a blade. He was blocking the exit now, his stance tense, and there was something in his eyes that Clarisse recognized. The soldier, the officer who had commanded men in battle, someone perfectly capable of violence when necessary. "Get out of my way, Frenchman," Hawthorne spat out. "No," Étienne did not move. "Release her, now." "Or what?" Hawthorne laughed, a humorless sound. "You will stop me. You, a foreigner with no rights here, will..." Étienne moved. It was not a wild attack, but something more controlled, more efficient, the kind of movement that comes from years of training. One hand shot out, grasping Hawthorne's wrist and applying pressure at precise points that made the man release Clarisse with a cry of pain. Then, before Hawthorne could react, Étienne spun him around, twisting his arm behind his back and forcing him against the nearest wall. "I said," Étienne repeated, his voice calm but lethal, "release her." Hawthorne tried to fight, tried to use his weight to break free, but Étienne simply applied more pressure, making him groan. "You are hurting me!" Hawthorne cried out. "Good," Étienne replied coldly. "Now you know how your victims feel, how that young woman felt, how Clarisse felt every time you grabbed her too hard, threatened her, made her feel fear." He looked around the room, all eyes fixed on them. "This is the true Lord Hawthorne, not the gentleman he pretends to be, but a coward who brutalizes those weaker than himself." "Release me," Hawthorne demanded, his voice shrill now. "This is assault. You will be arrested. You will be..." I will be what? Étienne asked softly, applying greater pressure to the restraint move. Accused of protecting a lady from violence? Of intervening when a man lost all control and decorum? He looked at Lord Ashworth. My lord, I suggest that officers be summoned to escort Lord Hawthorne from the premises. He is clearly in no condition to participate in civilized events. I agree completely, Lord Ashworth said, gesturing. 2 large men moved forward, taking control of Hawthorne from Étienne. But before he was dragged away, Hawthorne turned one last time to Clarisse, and there was so much hatred in his eyes that she instinctively recoiled. This is not over, he hissed. You owe me, Pemberton owes me, and I will have what is mine. You have nothing, Lady Harbury said, appearing beside Clarisse and wrapping a protective arm around her. Your debts will be paid by other means. Arrangements have already been made, but you will never come near this young woman again. You will never again have power over any helpless person, because now everyone knows who you truly are. And it was true. Hawthorne was dragged out, fighting and screaming threats that became increasingly incoherent. Every person in the hall looked on with a mixture of horror and revulsion. His mask had completely fallen, and what lay underneath was so ugly that no one could pretend not to see it. The silence that followed was absolute. 200 people remained motionless, processing what they had just witnessed, the complete and total downfall of a man who hours earlier had been considered respectable. What a scandalous night for the avid appetite of the London aristocracy. It was Lord Ashworth who finally broke the silence. Well, he said, clearing his throat, that was unprecedented. Lady Clarisse, he turned to her with genuine kindness, you have my deepest sympathy. No one should have to endure such revelations about someone to whom she was promised. Thank you, my lord, Clarisse managed to say, her voice trembling. She looked at her father, who was pale and shaking. Father? Lord Pemberton moved to her then, tears sliding down his face. Forgive me, he whispered. Forgive me for having... He couldn't finish, just pulled her into a tight embrace. Now, Lady Harbury said with restorative authority, I believe we all need a moment. Lady Clarisse, permit me to escort you to a quieter room. Lord Pemberton, join us. The rest of you. She looked around the hall. I suggest the music recommence, and that this matter be discussed with the discretion it deserves. It was a command disguised as a suggestion, and since no one dared challenge Lady Harbury, the crowd slowly began to move again, voices rising in urgent but lower conversations. Clarisse allowed herself to be guided out of the hall, Sabine on one side, Lady Harbury on the other, but before leaving she turned one last time. Étienne was still there, standing where Hawthorne had been dragged away, and when their eyes met, he placed a hand over his heart, a silent promise, a declaration that could not be made aloud but was understood nonetheless. And then she disappeared through the doors, and Étienne stood there, surrounded by curious gazes of admiration and speculative whispers, but not caring in the slightest, because she was free, finally truly free, and whatever came next, they would face together. A week had passed since that night at the Ashworths' ball, a week that for Clarisse had seemed both eternal and fleeting. London was still abuzz with the scandal. Lord Adrian Hawthorne had completely disappeared from society. Rumours said he had fled to the continent to escape his creditors. Others whispered he had been seen boarding a ship for the Americas. It didn't really matter. What mattered was that he was gone, and with him, the weight that had pressed down on Clarisse's chest for so long. But freedom had come with its own kind of pain. Glances at the theatres, whispers when she passed. The way some of the severer matrons averted their eyes as if she herself had done something wrong. The scandal, even when not her fault, still stained by association. Lady Harbury had assured her that it would pass, that society's memory was short, and that soon some other scandal would occupy their attention. But Clarisse had discovered that she did not care as much as she ought to, because the alternative, marrying Hawthorne, living under his control, suffering what that poor maid had suffered, was infinitely worse than a few disapproving glances. And there were the letters, 3 letters from Étienne that week, each delivered by a discreet messenger, each more precious than jewels. He wrote as he spoke, with careful economy, but with deep emotion just below the surface. He told her about his days, about meetings with lawyers to ensure her father's debts were properly paid, about conversations with Lady Harbury planning something. He never specified what, but there were promises in the lines, hopes that Clarisse barely dared to entertain, and now on this clear June morning she was in the drawing room of her home, her hands nervously clasped as her father paced back and forth near the fireplace. Lord Pemberton looked like he had aged a decade that week. Deep lines marked his face, his shoulders were slumped as if carrying a physical weight, and his eyes rarely met hers directly, as if the shame was too great to sustain contact. "Father," Clarisse said gently, "you need to stop blaming yourself." "How can I?" he replied, his voice rough. "I nearly sold you to a monster, for money, for convenience, for—" He ran a hand over his face. "For cowardice." "But you didn't," she insisted. "When it mattered, when you had to choose, you chose me." Before he could reply, the door opened, and the butler entered, his expression carefully neutral. "My lord, the Comte de Montclair and Monsieur Beaumont request a private audience." Clarisse's heart leaped to her throat. She knew they were coming. Étienne's letters had hinted as much, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself unable to breathe properly. Lord Pemberton straightened up, gathering what remained of his dignity. "Clarisse, go to your room, stay with your cousin." He turned to the butler. "Show them in." Moments later, they entered. Étienne in black as always, but there was something different about him today. A softer determination, a light in his eyes that was not present before, and beside him Lucien in deep blue, his characteristic smile firmly in place. "Lord Pemberton," Étienne began, bowing formally. "Thank you for receiving us." "Comte de Montclair," Lord Pemberton replied, and there was genuine respect in his voice now. "After what you did for my daughter, my house is always open to you." Étienne exchanged a glance with Lucien, who nodded encouragingly. Then he returned his attention to Lord Pemberton, his hands clasped behind his back, posture erect but not rigid. "I have come," he said, his voice clear and firm, "to formally request permission to court your daughter, Lady Clarisse, and if she accepts, to ask her hand in marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. Clarisse felt tears stinging her eyes, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Lord Pemberton looked at Étienne for a long moment, studying him. Then he said, "Do you understand that she carries scandal by association now? That her reputation has been tarnished not by her own fault but tarnished nonetheless?" "I understand perfectly," Étienne replied without hesitation, "and I do not care in the slightest. Society can think what it wishes. Only one who has passed through a period of deep darkness recognizes the gift of light when it appears on their path. I know who she is, a woman of extraordinary courage, of profound kindness, of a strength she herself does not fully recognize, and it would be the greatest honor of my life to stand by her side." Something passed across Lord Pemberton's face, relief perhaps, or gratitude. "Will you protect her? Will you care for her?" "With my life," Étienne said simply. "I have already proven I am willing to face a social scandal for her. I would burn the world for her. I would face wars. I would face much more, if necessary." Lord Pemberton nodded slowly. Then he turned to the door. "Send a maid to call Lady Clarisse, and Lady Sabine as well." Minutes that felt like hours passed before the door opened again. Clarisse entered first, Sabine right behind, and when her eyes met Étienne's, the rest of the room seemed to disappear. "Clarisse," her father said gently, "the Comte de Montclair has something to ask you." Étienne crossed the room to her, and Clarisse saw how his hands trembled minimally at his sides, how there was genuine nervousness in his eyes. He was not sure of her answer, she realized. Even after everything, even after that kiss in the garden and whispered confessions, he still feared rejection. "Lady Clarisse," he began, and his voice carried that accent she loved, that musicality that turned her name into poetry. "Weeks ago I was a man who believed he was dead inside, that there was nothing left for me but to exist, to pass through days without feeling, to carry guilt as penance for still breathing, when my brothers could not." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "And then I saw you in that drawing room in Kent, with flowers in your red hair and light in your sweet eyes, and something in me that was frozen began to melt. You showed me I was still capable of feeling, that there was reason to go on, that life could hold beauty even after so much darkness." Tears slid freely down Clarisse's face now, but she did not wipe them away. "You gave me something I did not know I needed. Hope, purpose, love." His voice broke, slightly on the last word. "And now I stand before you, not as a broken man, but as a man rebuilt by your kindness, your courage, your extraordinary soul. And I ask, with all the humility I possess." He knelt then, reaching into his pocket. "That you grant me the honor of being your husband, to protect you, to love you, to stand by your side for all the days I have left on this earth." He opened a small velvet box, revealing a ring, emerald surrounded by small diamonds, all green, and white light that caught the sunbeams from the window. "This ring," he said softly, "belonged to my mother. It is all I brought from France, all that remains of my family, and I want it to be yours, if you will accept me." Clarisse could not speak, emotion closing her throat. Then she simply nodded, tears still falling, and whispered, "Yes, yes, I accept." The transformation on his face was extraordinary. For a moment he just looked at her with that characteristic intensity, and then slowly, like dawn breaking after a long night, he smiled. It was not the half-smile she had occasionally seen. It was not merely a suggestion. It was a complete, genuine, devastatingly beautiful smile. The kind of smile that reached his eyes and made them shine, that softened all those lines of tension, that transformed him from a somber warrior into a fully living man. "You smiled," she whispered in wonder. "You truly smiled." "For you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Always for you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant to be there, and then brought her hand to his lips, kissing her fingers with infinite reverence. "No one," he said against her skin, his green eyes meeting hers with fierce promise, "will ever threaten you again, never hurt you again, never make you feel small or afraid again. I swear this by all that is sacred. I will protect you with my life." "Étienne," she said softly, conscious that others were still in the room but not caring, "I know that exposing everything that way was necessary, but I fear that the scandal will mark you," he completed, immediate understanding in his eyes. "I fear so, ma chérie, and for that I ask forgiveness. If there had been another way, any other way to free you without exposing you to judging glances and cruel whispers, I would have taken it. But there wasn't," she interrupted gently. "And I understand. I would rather be marked by the truth and be free of that monster than remain trapped in a respectable lie." She squeezed his fingers. "And from this day forward, I wish only to be marked by your love. Nothing else matters." His smile softened, becoming something intimate and precious. "Je t'aime," he whispered, his voice dropping to that husky tone that made her tremble. "Mon cœur, mon âme, ma raison de vivre. Je t'aime, plus que tout." Clarisse felt heat rise up her neck, to her cheeks, felt how those French words touched her in ways she did not even fully comprehend. "You shouldn't be so charming," she murmured, but she was smiling. "It's not fair." "Fair?" he repeated, his eyes dancing with amusement for the first time. "Love was never about fairness, ma belle. If it were, you would never have looked twice at a melancholy Frenchman who had forgotten how to smile. But you remembered," she said softly, "and that is all that matters." Across the room, Lucien cleared his throat dramatically. "Well, that was beautifully moving and all, but is anyone going to offer champagne? We have an engagement to celebrate properly." The tension broke into laughter. Lord Pemberton moved to pull the cord that would summon servants. Lady Sabine approached Clarisse with tears of her own in her eyes, hugging her cousin tightly. "I told you you were not alone," Sabine whispered. "I told you." "You told me," Clarisse agreed, squeezing her back. "Lady..." Harbury appeared moments later, clearly waiting nearby, a conspirator to the end, bringing with her a bottle of champagne under her arm. "I thought you might need this," she said, with that smile that suggested she had planned everything from the start. Glasses were filled, toasts were made, and while everyone laughed and conversed, Étienne remained close to Clarisse, never more than a few inches away, as if he feared she would disappear if he did not keep her in sight. It was Lucien, who finally raised his glass highest, silencing the group. "A toast," he declared, his blue eyes serious for once, "to two survivors, one of war, one of circumstance, both of a darkness that would have destroyed lesser souls, and a toast to the love that saved them. Not the fairy tale kind of love that magically solves everything, but the real kind. The kind that fights, that bleeds, that refuses to give up even when all seems lost. Two survivors," everyone repeated, glasses clinking. "And to new beginnings," Étienne added, looking only at Clarisse, "and to leaving the past where it belongs, behind us, where it can no longer hurt us. To new beginnings, Clarisse echoed, her eyes never leaving his. And as they drank, as laughter filled the drawing room and filtered sunlight through the windows painted everything in golden tones, Clarisse realized that for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt completely, genuinely happy. There was no longer a threatening fiancé. There was no longer a bleak future waiting to swallow her. There was only a man who loved her enough to fight for her, who saw her enough to risk everything for her, who had made her important enough to relearn how to smile. And as she watched Étienne de Valois, Comte de Montclair, laugh at something Lucien had just said, a genuine, open, free laugh, Clarisse knew that any scandal, any judging glance, any cruel whisper was absolutely worth it, because she was free. He was free, and together they would rebuild something beautiful from the rubble that destiny had tried to hand them. The future, for the first time, glowed with promise instead of threat, and it was more than enough. It was everything. 2 months later, St. George's Chapel, Windsor. The wedding day of Clarisse Pemberton and Étienne de Valois, Comte de Montclair, dawned with that golden quality that only September can produce in England. All soft light and crystal clear air, as if the universe itself was smiling upon them. The ceremony had been deliberately intimate, just family and closest friends. Lady Harbury had presided over everything with her characteristic efficiency, ensuring that every detail was perfect, from the white and apricot roses that decorated the chapel to the soft music that flowed through the ancient vaults. Clarisse wore ivory and lace, her red hair loose in curls that fell down her back, flowers intertwined amongst the strands. And when she entered the chapel on the arm of her father, a Lord Pemberton significantly more erect and dignified than months ago, and saw Étienne waiting at the altar, the smile that lit up her face was so radiant that several people in the audience felt tears welling up, but nothing compared to Étienne's expression when he saw her. His warm green eyes filled with something so profound it had no name. Adoration, gratitude, love so intense it was almost pain. And when she finally reached him, when she placed her hand in his, he whispered so low that only she heard, "Ma lumière, mon tout." The vows were exchanged with voices that were firm yet emotional. And when the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, when Étienne pulled her to him and kissed her, appropriate yet devastating in its tenderness, applause and happy tears filled the chapel. Lucien, serving as Étienne's best man, shouted, "Enfin!" with such enthusiasm that even the priest smiled. And Lady Sabine, beside Clarisse, was wiping away tears without even trying to hide them. The couple's first few months were spent at Thornfield House, Hampshire. The small estate Étienne had purchased was just 15 miles from London, close enough to access the city when necessary but far enough to have peace. It was not large, only 300 acres of arable land, a charming woodland, and a stone house that had been neglected for years but had good bones. "It's perfect," Clarisse declared the first time she saw it, and Étienne laughed, that laugh that still surprised her with its rarity and beauty. "It is a ruin that will require years of work," he corrected, but he was smiling. "Then we will rebuild it, mon amour," she responded simply, trying out her first words in French. "You and I." And they did exactly that. The first few months of marriage were a revelation for both of them. Étienne discovered he was completely incapable of passing Clarisse without touching her in some way, a stolen kiss on the staircase, his hands wrapping around her waist in the kitchen as she discussed menus with the housekeeper, fingers intertwined when they walked through the fields at dusk. "Vous êtes insatiable," Clarisse teased him, but she was always smiling. "Only in love," he replied, kissing her neck in a way that made her shiver. "It is different." "It is the same thing," she insisted, but turned in his arms nonetheless, allowing him to kiss her. Long and properly. He had a particular way of mixing French with English when he was emotional. "Mon cœur, you are so beautiful today. Ma belle, come here and kiss me. Je t'aime, more than words can say," that made her laugh and melt simultaneously. And there were the quieter moments, when he found her reading in the library and simply sat down beside her, his head on her shoulder, soaking in her presence, smelling her delicate scent. When she woke up in the morning and found him already awake, watching her with that expression of wonder as if he still couldn't quite believe she was his. When they shared comfortable silences that did not need to be filled with words. The solution to Lord Pemberton's debts had come unexpectedly. Étienne had sold his family jewels when he arrived from France, pieces that carried painful memories but substantial value, keeping only a wedding ring from his late mother, which was of incalculable sentimental value to him. This ring now rested on his wife's finger since his proposal. With the money from the sold jewels, he had invested the amount in a rapidly expanding railway company. It was a calculated risk, but Lucien knew the directors and had ensured the company was solid. Dividends began arriving within months, returns so substantial that they not only allowed Étienne to pay off a good portion of his father-in-law's debts, but also to provide Clarisse with a comfortable life and invest heavily in the improvement of Thornfield. "You are a financial genius," Clarisse declared when he showed her the numbers. "I am a desperate man who got lucky," he corrected, "and with a loyal friend who has good contacts." Lord Pemberton, in turn, had used his own freedom from debt to invest in the same railway shares, following his son-in-law's advice. The profits allowed him to not only settle the remaining debts, but also to restore some dignity to the Pemberton family. "I owe you more than I can express," he told Étienne during a dinner at Thornfield. "You gave me your daughter," Étienne replied simply. "The debt, if it exists, is mine." Thornfield transformed under their care. Étienne discovered he had a talent for land management. His military experience in logistics and organization translated surprisingly well to agriculture. He modernized cultivation techniques, treated tenants with fairness and respect, and invested in improvements that benefited everyone. "You should see how they adore you," Clarisse often said. "The tenants speak of the just Count as if you were some kind of hero." "I merely treat them as human beings," he replied, uncomfortable with praise. "It is not heroism, it is basic decency." But it was more than that, and they both knew it. It was a man who had survived war finding purpose not in destruction, but in building, not in dominating, but in cultivating. As for Hawthorne, news was confirmed through less formal channels. He had been seen boarding a second-class ship in Southampton bound for America, alone and visibly diminished. His creditors had taken everything. Properties, even his fine clothes, were auctioned off to cover a fraction of what he owed. Rumors said he tried to rebuild himself in Boston, but his reputation preceded him. London society had connections across the Atlantic, and letters were written, warnings were given. No one wanted to associate with a man publicly exposed as violent, bankrupt and morally corrupt. The last news that arrived months later was that he was working as a clerk in an obscure office, his arrogance broken, his future devoid of any bright prospect. "I should feel pity," Clarisse commented when Étienne shared the information. "But you do not," he observed, knowing her too well. "No," she admitted, "I do not. I think of that poor maid, Annie. I think of how many others he might have hurt if he hadn't been stopped, and I cannot mourn his downfall." "Nor can I," Étienne agreed, pulling her into his arms. "Some men create their own ruin. We merely hasten the inevitable." Grosvenor Square, London. 2 years later, Lady Harbury had prepared an intimate dinner, which, in her terms, meant only 15 carefully selected people. The table was stunning, all polished silver and crystal that caught the candlelight, and conversation flowed with that ease that only happens when people genuinely like one another. Clarisse was radiant that evening, wearing deep green that highlighted her eyes and made her red hair glow like fire. But there was something more, a particular shine, a softness in her features that made those who knew her well smile knowingly. "When are you going to tell?" Sabine whispered conspiratorially, seated beside her cousin. "Tell what?" Clarisse replied innocently, but she was smiling. "Clarisse Pemberton, pardon, Clarisse de Valois," Sabine corrected herself with a smile. "You are absolutely glowing, and I have already seen you pass your hand delicately over your belly unconsciously 3 times. I am not a fool." Clarisse laughed softly, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat abdomen. "We wanted to be sure first, but yes, 3 months. Sabine squeezed her hand with genuine joy. "Oh, Clarisse, that is wonderful." Across the table, Lucien was engaged in an apparently innocent conversation with Lord Pemberton, but his eyes kept darting towards Sabine with a frequency that was anything but subtle. "Lady Sabine," he had called to her earlier that evening, that provocative smile firmly in place. "You are particularly stunning tonight. That shade of blue suits your eyes perfectly." "Monsieur Beaumont," she had replied with studied coolness, but there was amusement in her eyes. Your French flatteries will not work on me. I have told you this before. Ah, but you say that even as you blush, he observed, leaning closer, which suggests perhaps they work a little. You are a conceited and incorrigible Frenchman, and you are irresistible, he retorted without missing a beat. See how well matched we are. Sabine rolled her eyes, but she was smiling, and when he offered his arm to escort her to dinner, she accepted without hesitation. Throughout the evening, the dynamic between them had become increasingly obvious. He teased her with witty comments. She countered with sharp intelligence. He found excuses to touch. Her hand when passing dishes. She pretended not to notice but blushed charmingly. Those two, Lady Harbury murmured to Étienne, who was seated to her right, are completely lost to each other and will not admit it yet. Lucien is in love, Étienne confirmed with a smile, though he insists it is merely intellectual fascination. And Lady Sabine? Is fighting it? Étienne watched Sabine laugh at something Lucien had just said, but losing the battle rapidly. Good, Lady Harbury said with satisfaction. My work here is almost complete then. After dinner, as the guests moved toward the music room, Clarisse found herself at the piano, that same piano where she had first played for Étienne, where everything had begun in so many ways. Play for us, dear, Lady Harbury suggested, and there was a gleam in her eyes that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Clarisse sat down, her fingers touching the keys with familiarity. She began with Mozart, the same sonata she had played that afternoon so long ago, but this time there was no sorrow in her interpretation, only pure joy. Étienne moved to stand beside the piano, watching her with that complete attention he always dedicated to her, and as she played, as music filled the room, he felt emotion rise in his throat, gratitude so deep it was almost pain. This woman, this extraordinary woman who had saved him without even knowing it, who had given him reason to live again, who now carried his child. When the music ended, when the last chord hung in the air, Étienne extended his hand. She placed hers in it without hesitation, allowing him to pull her up to stand. And then, before everyone, the society that had once judged them, the friends who had supported them, the family who loved them, he brought her hand to his lips, but it was not merely a courtly kiss. He turned her hand over, kissing her pulse where the beat fluttered, then her palm, holding it there for a long moment while his eyes, bright with unshed tears of joy, beat hers. Vous êtes mon monde, he whispered, just for her. Mon cœur, mon âme, ma raison de vivre. Et maintenant, notre enfant. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Clarisse felt her own tears threaten to spill over. Je t'aime, she whispered back, her French imperfect but sincere. He smiled then, that complete, devastatingly beautiful smile he reserved only for her, and whispered, Et je t'aimerai jusqu'à mon dernier souffle. Soft applause filled the room, but Clarisse barely heard it. There was only this man, this moment, this life they had built together from the wreckage of destinies others had tried to force upon them. There is something I must announce, Étienne said, his voice now projecting to include the entire group. He held Clarisse's hand firmly, as if afraid to let go even for a moment. Lady Harbury, Lord Pemberton, dear friends, Lady Clarisse and I will have the pleasure of welcoming a new member of the family next spring. The silence that followed lasted only a fraction of a second before the room erupted in congratulations. Lord Pemberton stood up, tears unashamedly running down his face as he hugged his daughter. Lady Harbury clapped her hands with genuine delight. Sabine shrieked and ran to embrace her cousin, and Lucien, blessed Lucien, raised his glass and declared, A toast to the Count who learned to smile, to the lady who taught him how, and to the little one who will be extraordinarily lucky to call them parents. Cheers! Echoed around the room. Later, when the guests had finally dispersed and only the closest family remained, Clarisse found herself in Lady Harbury's gardens, those same gardens where everything had changed, where kisses were stolen and promises were made. Étienne joined her moments later, wrapping her from behind, his hands resting protectively on her belly. Are you happy? She asked. Softly. I could not measure how much, my dear, he replied, kissing her neck. 2 years ago I was a man dead inside. Now, he turned her in his arms so he could see her face. Now I have you. I have a home. I have purpose. And soon I will have a child. How could I be happier? They say, Clarisse said mischievously, that Lucien and Sabine are finally admitting mutual feelings. If they marry, we will be proper extended family. Étienne laughed. Lucien is already my brother in everything but blood, and Sabine is your sister in everything but name. So we are already family, ma chérie, merely making the inevitable official. They stood there for a long moment, embraced beneath the stars, the same sky that had witnessed so much pain, now witnessing pure joy. Étienne, Clarisse said finally, thank you. For what? For fighting for me. For refusing to accept an unfair destiny that would have killed me slowly. For showing me that love can be gentle, that strength can be soft, that men can be honorable. She touched his face. For teaching me that happiness is worth fighting for. He caught her hand, kissing it again. You taught me the same thing. You taught me that there was still reason to live, that the past does not have to define the future, that even broken hearts can be mended if they find the right person. Then we mended each other, she said softly. We, he agreed, pulling her closer. And now we build something new, something beautiful, something no dark past can touch. And as he kissed her there under stars that shone with promise, as life grew within her and the future stretched brightly before them, Clarisse knew with absolute certainty, some stories end in tragedy, but others, the best ones, the most precious ones, end in love that conquers all. And theirs, against all odds, against destinies others tried to force, against darkness that threatened to engulf them, was one of those. A love story that won, finally, completely, forever. She was promised to another, but the Count who never smiled begged for a kiss. And in that kiss, they both found not just love, but redemption. For him, proof that he was still capable of feeling. For her, proof that she deserved to be loved. And together they built something that no war, no scandal, no darkness could destroy. A home where they both finally learned to smile. If you were moved by this journey, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any passionate romance. Share with those who love historical stories full of emotion and hard-won happy endings. And in the comments, tell me, what was your favorite moment? And what story would you like to see here on the channel? Leave your suggestions.